Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Midnight runs were my specialty, especially that stretch of I-40 through Arizona, where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. Been hauling refrigerated goods for 12 years, and after my daughter turned 18 and moved to college, those long nights on the road became my escape from an empty house. That particular September night started like any other, with me pulling a load of pharmaceuticals from Phoenix to Oklahoma City, the kind of high-value cargo that paid well but came with strict security protocols. My Peterbilt was my second home, equipped with everything I needed for a week on the road, including a comfortable sleeper bunk that I'd customized with extra locks and a small safe for my personal items. Around 2 in the morning, I pulled into a rest area near Flagstaff to update my logbook and stretch my legs, the kind of place where the overhead lights barely worked and the vending machines hadn't been restocked since the Clinton administration. Standing near the entrance ramp was this guy, maybe 45, wearing clean Carhartt work clothes and steel-toed boots that actually looked broken in from real labor. He approached my rig while I was checking the trailer seals, holding up a worn leather work bag and explaining how his ride to the copper mine had left him behind after a bathroom break, and if he missed his shift supervisor's morning head count, he'd lose his job for sure. Everything about him seemed legitimate, from the calluses on his hands to the way he knew specific mine terminology, even showing me a laminated ID badge for a mining operation I recognized about 60 miles east. He just needed a ride to the next truck stop where his cousin could pick him up, and since company policy technically prohibited passengers, he offered to stay hidden in the sleeper bunk until we got there, promising to keep quiet and not cause any trouble. Against every instinct I'd developed over the years, I told him to climb in through the passenger door and get comfortable in the back while I finished my mandatory break time. For the first 3 hours, everything seemed normal, as I pushed through the darkness toward New Mexico, occasionally hearing him shift position in the bunk behind me or clear his throat quietly. The electronic logging device showed me right on schedule. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily at -10 degrees. And dispatch hadn't sent any urgent messages about route changes or security alerts. I kept the radio low, listening to overnight talk shows discuss everything from alien abductions to government conspiracies, the usual background noise that kept solo drivers from going stir-crazy during those endless stretches of asphalt. The passenger stayed true to his word, keeping silent except for a polite request to use the portable urinal I kept behind the seat, and I actually started to feel good about helping someone who genuinely needed it. Around 5:30, with the first hints of dawn starting to lighten the eastern horizon, I pulled into a way station that was closed for the weekend, figuring I'd catch a quick power nap before the final push into Albuquerque. I woke up to the sound of metal scraping against metal, a noise that instantly triggered every security alarm in my head because I knew exactly where it was coming from. My locked toolbox under the bunk. Through the curtain separating the cab from the sleeper, I could see movement, deliberate and methodical, not the fumbling of someone looking for aspirin or trying to find the light switch. When I yanked the curtain aside, the passenger was crouched on the floor with my own socket wrench in his hand, working on the bolts that secured a hidden compartment where I kept emergency cash and my backup GPS tracker. But what really made my chest tighten was seeing him calmly photographing the broken seal on my trailer's internal access panel, the one that connected the cab to the refrigerated cargo area, a seal that absolutely could not be broken without triggering a massive security investigation. He looked up at me with this expression of mild annoyance, like I'd interrupted him during a routine maintenance check, then pulled out my own phone from his pocket, swiping through photos I hadn't taken, my regular fuel stops, the apartment complex where I parked on home time, even shots of my daughter's dorm building from her move-in day last month. "Morning, friend," he said in a voice completely different from the worried mine worker I'd picked up, now carrying a professional tone like someone explaining a business proposal over lunch. He set my phone on the dashboard, keeping it just out of my reach, and explained that his associates had been tracking my route for 6 weeks, learning my patterns, my stops, even monitoring which rest areas I preferred for my mandatory breaks. The pharmaceutical load I was hauling contained a specific batch of cancer medications worth about $3 million on the black market, information that definitely wasn't public knowledge, which meant someone inside my company or the client's operation had provided intelligence. He showed me timestamps on the photos, some taken just days ago, others going back over a month, including one of me having coffee with my ex-wife at a diner in Amarillo, proving they'd been watching me long before tonight. The mining story, the authentic-looking badge, the calloused hands, all of it was theater, carefully rehearsed to exploit the exact kind of sympathy that would make a lonely middle-aged driver break protocol on a dark night. What he wanted was simple enough to understand, but impossible to accept. I was supposed to drive to a specific coordinate, about 40 miles off the interstate, where his team would unload exactly 7 pallets from the middle section of my trailer, the ones containing the targeted medications. After the transfer, I'd continue to a predetermined ravine where I'd report my truck stolen, claiming I'd been ambushed at a rest stop while sleeping, and the company insurance would cover the loss while I walked away clean. He'd already manipulated my electronic logging device to show me taking a completely different route, sending false GPS pings to dispatch that placed me hundreds of miles from our actual location, creating a digital alibi that would make me look guilty if I tried to report what was really happening. The genius of their plan was its simplicity. If I cooperated, I'd be a victim, but if I refused or tried to alert anyone, the evidence would point to me as an inside accomplice who got cold feet, especially since I'd violated company policy by picking up a passenger in the first place. My CB radio, I realized when I glanced at it, had been opened up and rewired while I slept, the microphone cable neatly severed inside its casing, and my phone's battery, which had been fully charged when I went to sleep, now showed 2% despite being plugged into the charger he'd somehow disabled. He must have seen me eyeing the door handle because he casually mentioned that my keys were already with his partner, who was following us in a sedan about a quarter mile back, close enough to intervene if I tried anything stupid but far enough to avoid suspicion. The way he explained it, like discussing a pizza delivery route, made the whole thing even more terrifying because this was just another day at work for him, another driver to manipulate, another load to steal, another life to potentially destroy if things went sideways. When I asked what would happen if I refused to drive, he pulled up a video on my phone showing the inside of my daughter's dorm room, taken from her own laptop camera while she slept, her stuffed elephant from childhood visible on the nightstand beside her. Not a threat exactly, just a demonstration of capability, proof that their reach extended far beyond this truck, beyond this highway, into spaces I thought were protected by distance and anonymity. He even knew her class schedule, mentioning that she had organic chemistry at 10 on Mondays, information that turned my stomach into a knot of pure dread because it meant they'd been watching her too, studying her routines just like they'd studied mine. I started the engine because what else could I do? My mind racing through scenarios that all ended badly while he settled into the passenger seat like we were old friends on a road trip. The coordinates he gave me led through a series of back roads I'd never traveled, past abandoned gas stations and collapsed barns that looked like they'd been rotting since the Reagan years, the kind of places where trucks weren't supposed to go, but where someone could easily disappear. He made me turn off the dash cam, physically removing the memory card and crushing it under his boot heel, then had me disable the trailer's refrigeration alarm so it wouldn't alert dispatch when the temperature rose from opening the doors. Every few minutes he'd check something on a tablet he produced from his bag, tracking our progress against some predetermined timeline, occasionally sending messages to people whose roles I could only imagine. The worst part was how normal he acted between giving instructions, asking about my years on the road, commenting on the sunrise, even offering me a stick of gum from a pack he'd found in my console, as if we weren't in the middle of committing a federal crime that would end my career and probably my freedom. When we reached the transfer point, an abandoned grain elevator surrounded by rusted silos and dead wheat fields. 3 men were already waiting with an unmarked box truck that looked like it hauled furniture or appliances. They worked with practiced efficiency, knowing exactly which pallets to take, using a portable forklift they'd brought to move the medications from my trailer to theirs in less than 20 minutes, never speaking to me or even acknowledging I existed beyond being the driver of the vehicle they were robbing. The passenger supervised the operation while maintaining his grip on my phone and keys, occasionally showing me the tablet screen where my truck still appeared to be traveling normally along I-40, according to the spoofed signals being sent to my company's tracking system. One of the men spray-painted over the serial numbers on the stolen pallets. Another took photos of the remaining cargo to ensure they'd left the right items behind. And the third carefully resealed the trailer doors with a device that somehow replicated the original seal's code, making it look like they'd never been opened. The whole operation felt like watching a pit crew at a NASCAR race, each person knowing their exact role, their precise movements, no wasted motion or unnecessary communication, just criminal efficiency perfected through repetition. After they left with the medications, the passenger directed me to continue driving deeper into nowhere, following dirt roads that my GPS didn't even recognize, until we reached a ravine where old appliances and stripped cars had been dumped over the decades. He explained that I'd leave the truck here, keys in the ignition, doors unlocked, making it look like I'd been carjacked by opportunistic thieves who dumped the rig after realizing they couldn't fence pharmaceutical cargo. His partner would drive me to a truck stop about 50 miles away, where I'd call the police and report the theft, sticking to a script he made me memorize about stopping to help what looked like a broken-down motorist and being overwhelmed by multiple attackers. The beauty of their plan was that the physical evidence would match my story. The truck would be found abandoned, the high-value cargo missing, the electronic logs showing me miles away from where the actual theft occurred, and my violation of company policy by picking up a hitchhiker would be buried under the larger crime. He even had a bruise kit in his bag, offering to give me some convincing injuries to support my story, though I declined that particular service, already feeling sick enough about what I'd been forced to participate in. But something shifted in my mind when he mentioned my daughter again, reminding me that cooperation was my only option if I wanted to keep her safe from any future complications. That's when I noticed the tablet he'd been using was still unlocked, sitting on the dashboard while he gathered his things from the sleeper compartment, the screen showing what looked like a messaging app with timestamps and locations. Without really thinking about consequences, I grabbed it and took photos with an old digital camera I kept in the door pocket for accident documentation, capturing screen after screen of their communication network, pickup coordinates, even partial names and phone numbers. My fingers working faster than my brain could process the stupidity of what I was doing. He caught me just as I was sliding the camera back into its spot, his expression shifting from mild surprise to something darker, but then he actually smiled and said it didn't matter because the tablet would be destroyed within the hour anyway. And who would believe a driver who'd already lied to police about a hijacking? The confidence in his voice suggested this wasn't bravado, but experience, that he'd dealt with desperate drivers before, ones who thought they could outsmart the system only to realize they were already too deep in the mud to crawl back out. The sedan that picked me up from the ravine was driven by a woman who never spoke, just drove while the passenger sat behind me, making sure I didn't try to memorize the route back or do anything clever with the door handles. At the truck stop, they left me with my dead phone, $20 for food, and a final reminder that my daughter's safety depended on me following through with the story, that their organization had a long memory and an even longer reach for people who complicated their operations. I waited exactly 30 minutes like they instructed, then used the payphone to call 911, my voice genuinely shaking as I reported the theft, the lie coming out easier than I expected because most of it was true. I had been forced at gunpoint to drive my truck somewhere. Men had stolen my cargo, and I'd been left stranded at a truck stop. The police believed me. The company investigators believed me. Even the FBI agents who eventually got involved believed me, especially after the truck was found exactly where I said it would be, stripped of its valuable cargo but otherwise intact. What I never told anyone was about the camera's memory card I'd hidden in my boot. Those photos I'd managed to capture. Evidence I kept for 3 months before finally mailing it anonymously to the DEA from a post office 2 states away, along with dates, routes, and every detail I could remember about the operation. 6 months later, I read about a major pharmaceutical theft ring being busted across 3 states. Dozens of arrests, including several trucking company employees who'd been feeding them information about high-value loads. The article mentioned recovered cancer medications worth millions, sophisticated GPS spoofing equipment, and a network that had been operating for years using the same method, recruiting desperate drivers through carefully orchestrated hitchhiker scenarios. I never found out if my anonymous tip contributed to the investigation, but I recognized one detail in the news coverage. They'd tracked the gang through digital communications on encrypted tablets, the exact kind of evidence I'd photographed during those terrified seconds in my cab. My daughter never knew how close danger had come to her life. Still doesn't know why I insisted she transfer to a different college mid-semester, or why I paid for her to change apartments and get a new phone number. I quit long-haul driving after that night, took a local delivery job that pays half as much, but lets me sleep in my own bed, behind doors I can lock, in a house where I installed security cameras that I check obsessively, even though it's been over a year without any sign of trouble. The passenger's words still echo sometimes when I'm driving past rest stops on the interstate. That casual confidence when he said they'd done this before and would keep doing it until someone stopped them. I think about all the other drivers out there pulling lonely night shifts, checking their mirrors for following cars, wondering if that person standing by the entrance ramp really needs help, or if they're bait for something worse. The company never found out I'd broken policy by picking up a hitchhiker. The investigation focused entirely on the theft itself, and I kept my commercial license clean enough to keep working, though I'll never look at a load manifest the same way again. People ask me sometimes why I switched to day routes, why I gave up the better money, and I tell them I got tired of sleeping in the truck, which is true enough even if it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I learned the hard way how one moment of misplaced kindness, one decision to help a stranger on a dark highway, can turn you into a criminal, whether you meant to be one or not, and some mistakes follow you home no matter how many miles you put between yourself and that rest stop in Arizona. February of 2017 found me hauling refrigerated produce from Florida up to Boston. Same route I'd been running since my divorce papers got finalized, and I needed steady miles to keep my mind occupied. Most drivers my age were settling into local routes, but at 43, I preferred the long stretches where nobody asked questions, and dispatchers only cared if you made your delivery window. That particular Wednesday night, I'd already logged 11 hours, and was pushing through that dead zone on I-95 between Jacksonville and Savannah, where cell towers get scarce, and the only company comes from static on the CB radio. My Freightliner had just crossed the 200,000-mile mark that morning, and I remember thinking how she still purred like a kitten when I kept her steady at 65, riding that sweet spot where the diesel engine hummed its lowest note. Around 2 in the morning, just past mile marker 42 where the highway cuts through nothing but pine forest and swamp, I caught sight of another rig's lights in my mirrors, maybe half a mile back, but gaining faster than they should have been. Now any trucker will tell you that nighttime on these empty stretches creates a kind of brotherhood. We watch out for each other, flash warnings about speed traps or debris, check on drivers who seem to be weaving from fatigue. But this rig behind me wasn't following any of the unwritten rules we all knew by heart. He'd speed up until his headlights filled my mirrors, then drop back suddenly, then surge forward again, like he was sizing me up or trying to read my trailer numbers in the dark. My CB had been quiet for the last hour, except for the occasional ghost signal from truckers too far away to understand. But then Channel 19 crackled to life with a voice that sounded like gravel mixed with cigarette smoke. "Slow your roll, friend, we gotta talk," the voice said. And right away I knew this wasn't any DOT inspection or friendly warning about a blown tire. Real truckers don't talk like that. Don't use that fake casual tone that tries too hard to sound harmless. I kept my speed steady and reached for my CB mic, but before I could respond, the rig behind me hit its hazards and started flashing its high beams in a pattern. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long again. That's when my gut started churning, because that wasn't any trucker signal I'd learned in 20 years of hauling freight. I watched him in my mirrors as he moved into the left lane and pulled alongside my trailer, matching my speed perfectly while his passenger window came down and someone aimed a spotlight at my DOT numbers and the sealed door of my refrigerated unit. The voice came back on the radio, clearer now that he was right beside me. "Nice load you're carrying there, driver. 40,000 pounds of strawberries heading to Boston. Delivery tomorrow at 1600 hours to the Hunts Point warehouse." My knuckles went white on the steering wheel because that information wasn't something you could guess. Someone had either hacked into our dispatch system or had an inside source at my company. I glanced at my phone mounted on the dashboard, showing 1 bar of signal that kept flickering to none, and realized we were approaching the Ridgeland exit where there was a way station that had been closed for renovations for the past 3 months. Just a dark pullout with no cameras and no witnesses. The rig beside me started edging closer, not enough to hit me, but enough to make his intentions clear. We were going to have that talk whether I wanted to or not. I tried to accelerate past him, but another set of headlights appeared in front of me, a second rig that had been running dark until now, slowing down to trap me in the right lane. They had me boxed in like wolves cornering prey, and when I grabbed my CB to call for help on Channel 9, the emergency frequency, all I got was dead static like someone was running a jammer. The lead truck ahead started pumping his brakes, forcing me to slow from 65 to 40, then 30, as we approached that abandoned way station. My fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, enough to make Boston if I didn't stop, but not enough to outrun these guys if this turned into a chase. The voice on the radio came back, and this time I could hear other voices in his cab, at least 2 more people, all of them laughing at something that hadn't been said yet. "Here's the thing, friend," he continued, and I could tell he was enjoying this, drawing it out like a cat playing with its food. "Your company owes our mutual broker 60 grand for that Miami deal that went sideways last month. The one where your dispatcher claimed the load got refused but somehow still got delivered and paid out to the wrong account. Now we could handle this through lawyers and insurance companies, could make a real mess of things, get DOT involved, maybe have them crawl through every logbook violation and overweight ticket your company ever collected. Or we could settle this tonight, just between professionals, and everybody goes home happy." I'd never heard of any Miami deal, had been running the Boston route exclusively for 6 months, but the way he said it made me realize this wasn't about truth or lies. This was about 3 trucks against 1 on a dark highway where anything could happen and be explained away as driver error or equipment failure. The truck in front of me suddenly hit his brakes hard, and I had no choice but to follow him into the way station pullout, my wheels crunching over broken asphalt and glass from who knows how many years of neglect. As soon as I stopped, the rig behind me pulled in diagonal across the exit, blocking any chance of escape, while the one that had been beside me positioned itself along my driver's side, so close I couldn't open my door without hitting his fuel tank. Before I could even set my parking brake, I heard boots hitting pavement and saw a figure climbing up onto my trailer using the rear door handles, a thick-shouldered man wearing coveralls with no company logo and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had something in his hand that looked like a modified tire pressure gauge connected to a small metal cylinder, and he was heading straight for my glad hand connections, where the air lines from my cab connect to the trailer brakes. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice on the CB said, while I watched the man on my trailer kneel down near the connections. "All we want is 1 pallet from your load. Just 1 single pallet of those premium berries. Call it a finder's fee for helping you remember that debt. Your manifest shows 42 pallets, you roll into Boston with 41. Tell them 1 got damaged, some boxes crushed, had to dump it for safety. Insurance covers the loss, your company takes a small hit, nobody gets hurt, and we all pretend this never happened." Through my passenger mirror, I could see 2 more people had gotten out of the rear truck, both carrying what looked like crowbars or tire irons, standing casual but ready, like they'd done this before and knew exactly how it would play out. The man on my trailer did something with his device, and I heard a sharp hiss of air, then felt my trailer brakes engage slightly, just enough to know that whatever he'd done, I wouldn't be driving away without his permission. I reached for my phone to try calling 911, but the screen showed no service, not even emergency calls, and when I tried to take a photo of the trucks around me, the camera app kept crashing like the phone itself was fighting against me. That's when the real fear set in. Not the adrenaline rush of a dangerous situation, but that cold, deep dread when you realize how thoroughly you've been trapped. The CB crackled again, and this time it was a different voice, younger, with a slight southern drawl. "Your ELD just showed a critical fault, driver. Says you've been running off duty for the last 6 hours when you were actually driving. That's a federal violation right there. Could lose your CDL for that kind of falsification." I looked at my electronic logbook display, and sure enough, it was showing error codes I'd never seen before. My carefully logged hours replaced with gibberish that would make me look guilty of exactly what they were claiming. "Now here's where we're at," the first voice returned, sounding almost bored now that they knew they had me. "You can sit there and be stubborn, and we'll call this in to state police. Report an erratic driver who's been falsifying logs, probably on stimulants, aggressive, refused to stop when concerned fellow drivers tried to check on him. By the time cops get here, if they even come to this dead zone, they'll find your logs all messed up. Maybe find some contraband that wasn't there before, if you know what I mean. Or you can open that trailer, let us take what we're owed, and drive away clean, maybe a little lighter but still with your career intact." The man who'd been working on my trailer jumped down and walked to my passenger door, tapping on the window with that modified gauge device, grinning like we were old friends sharing a joke. Behind him, one of the others was already setting up what looked like a portable loading ramp, the kind you'd use to roll pallets off a trailer without a dock, and I realized they'd come prepared for this exact scenario, had probably done it dozens of times before to drivers just like me. Something inside me shifted then. Maybe it was pride, or maybe just the simple math that giving in now meant they'd own me forever, knowing I'd helped them steal once and could be squeezed again and again. I grabbed my CB mic and switched to channel 17, a frequency some old-timers still monitored, and started talking fast and clear. "Break 17. This is Unit 449 southbound at the closed Ridgeland scale. 3 trucks running a cargo theft setup, blocking me in, tampering with my equipment. Need immediate assistance. Any driver copy?" For a second there was nothing but static. Then suddenly multiple voices came through, truckers who'd been listening in the dark, and I heard someone say they were northbound 5 miles out and coming hard. The voice on channel 19 turned ugly quick. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, driver. You're gonna regret that." But I'd already started recording everything on my personal dashcam that they didn't know about, the one I'd hidden behind my sun visor after a friend got burned in an insurance scam. I kept talking on channel 17, describing the trucks, reading out partial plate numbers when their lights hit them right, and within minutes I could see headlights in the distance, lots of them, a convoy of drivers who'd heard the call and decided enough was enough. The thieves saw them too, and suddenly their careful plan fell apart as they scrambled back to their rigs, the man with the device yanking something from my airlines that made a loud pop and sent air hissing everywhere. They peeled out of that rest stop so fast they left their loading ramp behind, and as the other truckers pulled in around me, creating a protective circle with their rigs, I sat there shaking, not from fear anymore, but from anger at how close I'd come to losing everything I'd worked for. One of the drivers who'd responded, an older woman driving for night transportation, helped me check my airlines and found the jamming device still partially attached, a piece of evidence that would later help state police track down similar attacks across 3 states. The police report I filed that night ran 12 pages long, and the detective who interviewed me said I was lucky. 2 other drivers hadn't been so fortunate that month, one run completely off the road near Fayetteville when he tried to resist, another found at a truck stop beaten so badly he couldn't identify his attackers. My damaged airlines cost $800 to properly repair, and my company had to send another driver to team with me to Boston. Since my ELD data was so corrupted, it took their IT department 3 days to restore it. But what still haunts me, what makes me check my mirrors constantly even now, 6 years later, is knowing how perfectly they'd planned it all. The dead zone location, the ELD tampering, the broker story that sounded just plausible enough. The way they knew exactly which buttons to push to make a driver choose between his cargo and his career. I still run that same stretch of I-95, still past that abandoned way station, now finally demolished and turned into just another patch of forest. But I never run it alone anymore. I joined a group of drivers who coordinate their routes through that corridor, making sure nobody's isolated in those dead zones where cell towers don't reach and help is just a wish. We've got our own channel now, Channel 38, and we check in every 20 miles. A rolling safety net of drivers who learned the hard way that the real danger on these highways isn't falling asleep at the wheel or blown tires or bad weather. It's the predators who know exactly how vulnerable we are out here, alone in our cabs with hundreds of thousands of dollars of cargo and nothing but a thin sheet of aluminum between us and whoever decides we're worth the risk. The FBI eventually arrested 7 people connected to that ring, though the voice on the radio that night, the one who seemed to be running the show, was never identified. Sometimes on quiet nights when I'm running through that stretch, I still hear whispers on Channel 19, voices that sound almost familiar, asking innocent questions about what drivers are hauling and where they're headed. And I wonder how many more crews are out there, waiting in the dark for the next driver who's running alone, tired, and far from help. "12 years hauling freight across the western states teaches you which jobs to take and which ones to leave alone. But sometimes the money talks louder than your instincts. Most drivers my age were either settling into local routes or had moved up to owning their own rigs. But here I was at 37, still taking whatever paid best. Still sleeping in truck stop parking lots and showering at Flying J locations from Nevada to California. My ex-wife used to say I was married to the road more than I ever was to her, and maybe she had a point, but those long stretches of empty highway paid for our daughter's college tuition. So I kept my complaints to myself and my eyes on the white lines disappearing under my headlights. When dispatch called me about a construction debris contract paying triple the usual rate, I should have asked more questions. But rent was coming up, and my transmission had been making expensive sounds lately. The job seemed straightforward enough. Pick up loads from a demolition site about 60 miles outside of Reno, haul them to a specialized disposal facility near the California border, mostly night runs to avoid the heat and traffic. The company, Silverstone Disposal Solutions, had all their paperwork in order, proper permits, insurance verification. Everything checked out when I ran it through the carrier's system. They even offered a bonus for drivers who could handle multiple runs per week, cash paid daily, which wasn't standard but wasn't unheard of either in this business. My first pickup was scheduled for a Monday night at 11, and the directions took me way off the interstate, down a series of progressively narrower roads, until I was navigating by GPS alone through terrain that looked like it hadn't seen development since the mining boom ended. The site itself was an old casino complex, one of those places that tried to capitalize on being halfway between Reno and nowhere, probably went belly up when the recession hit and never recovered. Chain-link fencing surrounded the property, portable floodlights running off generators, and a crew of maybe 8 guys working with excavators and dump trucks, breaking down what was left of the main building. The foreman, a guy named Vince with arms like telephone poles and a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, barely looked at my paperwork before pointing me to where they were loading. They had me back up to a pile of broken concrete, rebar, drywall chunks, the usual demolition mix, and started loading my trailer with an excavator that had seen better days. The operator knew his business, though, distributed the weight properly, didn't overload, and in 20 minutes I was tarped up and ready to roll. Vince handed me an envelope with $500 in cash, said it was for fuel and expenses, told me there'd be another 500 waiting at the disposal site. The whole thing felt more like a drug deal than a legitimate hauling contract. But I'd worked with contractors who operated in cash before, guys who kept their money away from ex-wives or the IRS. So I tucked the envelope in my jacket and headed out into the desert night. The disposal facility was another 2 hours west, and about halfway there, I had to pull over for a mandatory inspection at a weigh station that I knew would be closed, but still required a logged stop for compliance. Part of the routine was checking the load, making sure the tarps were secure. Nothing had shifted during transport. I climbed up on the passenger side, flashlight between my teeth, and started checking the bungee cords when I noticed one corner of the tarp had worked loose, probably from the wind resistance at highway speeds. As I reached over to resecure it, my flashlight beam caught something white among the chunks of concrete and drywall, something that made me pause and lean in closer. At first, I thought it was PVC pipe or maybe some kind of insulation, but the texture was wrong, too smooth, too organic looking. I pulled the tarp back further, used my hand to brush away some of the smaller debris, and that's when I saw the teeth. 3 molars still attached to a piece of jawbone, mixed in with the rubble like they belonged there. My first thought was that maybe it was from an animal, deserts full of dead livestock and wild horses, but I'd seen enough deer skulls and cow bones growing up in ranch country to know the difference. These were human teeth, human bone, and as I stood there on the side of my trailer in the middle of the Nevada desert, I realized that the crushing sounds I'd heard while they were loading might not have all been concrete breaking apart. The smart thing would have been to cover it back up, deliver the load, take my money and forget I ever saw anything, but I kept thinking about news stories I'd seen, missing persons cases, families waiting for answers. I took pictures with my phone, close-ups of the bones, wider shots showing them mixed in with the debris, then carefully covered everything back up and secured the tarp. My plan was to finish the delivery, act normal, then figure out who to contact once I was somewhere safe with better cell service. The disposal facility was exactly where they said it would be, a massive pit operation with industrial grinders and sorting equipment, the kind of place that could make anything disappear into landfill material within hours. The night supervisor, a nervous-looking guy who kept checking his phone, handed me another envelope without saying much, just pointed where to dump the load. I watched the excavator grab huge chunks of my cargo, including the section where I'd found the bones, and feed it all into a grinding machine that turned everything into gravel-sized pieces. The drive back to Reno gave me too much time to think, and by dawn, I'd made my decision to call the state police from a truck stop near Carson City. The detective I spoke to, a woman named Diane Reeves, took my report seriously enough to meet me within an hour, looked at my photos, took copies of all my paperwork. She told me to continue with my scheduled runs, act like nothing had changed while they investigated quietly. What she didn't tell me, what I found out later from another driver at a rest stop, was that I wasn't the first one to report finding human remains and construction debris from sites connected to Silverstone disposal. 2 other drivers had come forward in the past year, but both had mysteriously decided to recant their statements after receiving better-paying job offers from affiliated companies, jobs that took them far away from Nevada. Detective Reeves had me wear a wire for my next pickup, said they needed more evidence before they could move on Silverstone, wanted me to get Vince or someone else talking about what they were really hauling. The weight of that recording device taped to my chest made every breath feel like a confession, and when I pulled up to the demolition site that next night, Vince took one look at me and I knew he could tell something was different. He walked around my truck twice, slow and deliberate, ran his hand along the undercarriage like he was checking for tracking devices, then leaned in close enough that I could smell the cigarettes and coffee on his breath. He asked if I'd had any trouble with the last load, if anyone had given me problems at the disposal site, and when I said no, he smiled in a way that made my skin prickle with sweat despite the cool desert air. That night they loaded my trailer with unusual care, Vince personally supervising every scoop, and when they were done he climbed up to check the tarp himself, his boots leaving muddy prints on my running boards. He found my phone in the cab where I'd left it charging, turned it over in his hands like he was memorizing the model, then set it back down exactly where it had been. Before I left, he handed me the cash envelope but held onto it when I tried to take it. Made me look him in the eye while he told me that Silverstone valued loyalty, that drivers who kept their routes running smooth could make more money than they'd ever dreamed of, but drivers who complicated things had a tendency to find other work real quick. The whole time he was talking, one of his crew members was taking pictures of my license plate, my dot numbers, making sure they had everything they needed to find me again if they had to. I made that delivery with my knuckles white on the steering wheel, dumped the load without looking at what might be mixed in with the concrete this time, and drove straight back to Detective Reeves at the state police station. The recording hadn't picked up anything useful, just ambient noise and Vince's carefully chosen words that could mean anything to anyone listening. Reeves said they'd need me to do one more run, maybe two, that they were close to getting a warrant, but needed something more concrete. And I laughed at her choice of words even though nothing about this was funny. She promised they'd have undercover units watching me, that I'd be safe, but we both knew that was the kind of lie cops tell witnesses to keep them cooperating. I told her I'd think about it, needed to sleep on it, but the truth was, I'd already decided to take one more load from whatever long-distance company would have me, and never set foot in Nevada again. That night I parked at a Love's truck stop just outside Sparks, figured I'd be safer surrounded by other drivers than alone somewhere, and tried to get some sleep in my cab. Around 3 in the morning, something woke me up, a subtle shift in the weight of my truck, like someone had climbed onto the back. I lay still, listening, heard footsteps on the metal deck of my trailer, moving slowly from the rear toward the cab. Through my side mirror, I could see a shadow, human-shaped but moving wrong, checking each tie-down strap, each tarp corner, methodical and patient like they had all night to do whatever they'd come to do. Then the footsteps stopped right outside my sleeper, and I heard fingers running along the rivets of my door, testing the lock, and a voice I recognized but couldn't quite place whispered my name, my actual name, not my handle or my company number, and told me that Silverstone had a message for me about keeping my scheduled runs. I didn't wait to hear the rest of the message, just fired up the engine and pulled out of that parking spot so fast I nearly clipped the fuel island, saw in my mirrors the shadow figure stumbling backward off my running board. Other drivers were already stirring, lights coming on in nearby cabs, and I knew whoever had come for me wouldn't try anything with that many witnesses around. I drove straight through the rest of the night, called Detective Reeves from the road and told her everything, said I was done being bait, that she had 12 hours before I was crossing into Oregon and never coming back. She tried to convince me to stay, said they were hours away from making arrests, but then I heard something in the background of her call, Vince's voice talking to someone in her office, asking about paperwork for a witness who'd been in an unfortunate trucking accident, and I knew right then that Silverstone's reach went deeper than anyone had imagined. The FBI raids happened 6 days later, made national news for about a week before getting buried under political scandals and celebrity divorces. But by then, I was already running produce from Washington to Montana, sleeping in different truck stops every night, never staying in one place long enough for anyone to track my patterns. They arrested 17 people, including Vince, found evidence linking Silverstone to disposal of bodies from organized crime hits across 3 states, victims who'd been mixed into construction debris and scattered across legitimate landfills where they'd never be found or identified. Detective Reeves sent me one message saying they couldn't have done it without my photos and initial report, but I knew better than to respond. Knew that even with Vince locked up, there were others out there who remembered my face, my truck, my name. Some nights I still wake up thinking I hear footsteps on my trailer, still check my mirrors for vehicles that follow too long, still wonder about every load of construction debris I see on the highway, and what secrets might be buried beneath those blue tarps, ground down into dust and scattered to the desert wind. My CDL still sits in my wallet, expired now for 2 years. Right behind the credit cards, I maxed out paying for lawyers after everything went sideways with that government contract job. I keep meaning to throw the license away, but something always stops me. Maybe because getting rid of it would mean accepting that my trucking days are really over, that what happened on Highway 54 outside Liberal, Kansas, changed everything permanently. Secured Transit Solutions hired me for what seemed like a straightforward flatbed haul in early November. Just another specialized equipment run from their facility near Topeka to a research center in Colorado Springs. I'd been driving flatbed for over a decade by then, mostly independent contracts after leaving my job with a major carrier when I turned 33, and government subcontractor work paid well enough to keep my Peterbilt running and the mortgage current on my place outside Wichita. Carla from STS called me directly, said she got my number from another driver who'd done classified hauls before, and asked if I could be at their loading facility within 48 hours for a priority shipment. The money she quoted made me sit up straight at my kitchen table, triple my usual rate with a cash advance that would hit my account before I even hooked up the trailer. She emailed over the contracts, pages and pages of confidentiality agreements and liability waivers, all standard-looking legal language except for one section that specified I couldn't discuss the cargo with anyone, including law enforcement, unless presented with a federal warrant. The loading appointment was set for 6 in the morning on a Monday, and when I arrived at their facility, a converted warehouse complex surrounded by fresh razor wire and cameras every 20 feet, 2 guards in unmarked uniforms checked my ID 3 times before waving me through the gate. Inside the loading bay, they already had the cargo on a specialized flatbed trailer, everything covered with military-grade tarps that had been heat-sealed at the edges and secured with numbered cable locks that I wasn't allowed to touch. The load itself was strange. 3 identical rectangular shapes about 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, positioned perfectly parallel to each other with custom steel brackets holding them in place. I walked around the trailer doing my standard pre-trip inspection, while a guy in a black polo shirt followed me with a clipboard, writing down every move I made, even noting when I checked the tire pressure. When I tried to peek under one corner of the tarp to verify the load was properly secured, he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks and reminded me about the confidentiality agreement I'd signed. They handed me a sealed envelope with routing instructions that I wasn't supposed to open until I left the facility, along with a cheap prepaid phone that I was told to keep on at all times. Carla appeared one more time before I left, walking up to my cab window with another set of papers for me to sign, these ones acknowledging that I understood the federal penalties for discussing classified materials. She leaned in close enough that I could smell her coffee breath and told me that this load was time-sensitive, that people were counting on me to deliver it exactly as instructed, no stops except at the 3 designated fuel stations marked on my route. The way she said it made the hair on my arm stand up, like there was some kind of threat hidden in her words. But the deposit had already cleared in my account, and backing out would mean returning money I'd already mentally allocated to overdue bills. I opened the envelope once I hit Highway 50, pulling over at a weigh station to read through the instructions, while my hands trembled slightly from too much coffee and not enough sleep. The route they'd mapped out made no sense, taking me south through Liberal instead of the direct path west on 70, adding at least 4 hours to what should have been a simple 8-hour drive. Each fuel stop had specific instructions: park in the northwest corner of the lot, leave the engine running, go inside for exactly 15 minutes, buy something, use the restroom, return to the truck without speaking to other drivers. The prepaid phone rang as I was reading, a robotic voice asking for my exact GPS coordinates, then hanging up before I could ask any questions. Everything went smooth for the first 3 hours, just me and the steady hum of the diesel engine, watching the Kansas farmland roll by in the pale morning light. Made my first scheduled stop at a Shell station near Pratt, followed the instructions to the letter, bought a sandwich I didn't want, and used a bathroom I didn't need while watching the clock on my phone. Nobody approached the truck while I was inside, but when I came back out, there was a white sedan parked 3 spaces away with tinted windows and government plates, engine running, nobody visible inside. The same car followed me back onto the highway, staying exactly 5 car lengths behind for the next 30 miles, before taking an exit that led to nothing but wheat fields. The second stop was supposed to be at a Conoco near Meade, but when I got there around noon, the place was crawling with state troopers. 4 cruisers parked at different angles around the pumps like they were waiting for something. I circled the lot once, my gut telling me to keep driving, but the prepaid phone started ringing non-stop until I finally pulled in and parked where I'd been instructed. None of the troopers even looked my way, which somehow made it worse, like they were deliberately avoiding eye contact. Inside the store, the clerk, a kid maybe 19 with bad acne scars, kept glancing at the door while he rang up my energy drink, and when he handed me my change, he whispered something that sounded like, "They're watching," before turning away to stock cigarettes. By the time I reached Highway 54 heading toward Liberal, the weather had turned nasty, dark clouds rolling in from the west, with that greenish tinge that makes any Midwest driver nervous about tornadoes. The prepaid phone had been silent since the Conoco stop, which worried me more than the constant check-ins. About 15 miles outside Liberal, just past a sign for some abandoned grain elevator, I saw them in my mirrors. 2 black Suburbans coming up fast, no plates visible, windows dark as oil. They boxed me in smooth as anything, one in front and one behind, and the lead vehicle hid its hidden blue lights, the kind mounted behind the grille that you'd never notice until they were flashing right in your face. I pulled over on the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. 4 men got out, all wearing identical black tactical pants and navy windbreakers with no agency markings, just little radio earpieces and holstered sidearms. The one who approached my window had a shaved head and a neck tattoo that looked military, some kind of unit insignia I didn't recognize. He didn't show a badge, didn't introduce himself, just told me to step out of the vehicle and keep my hands visible. When I asked what this was about, he grabbed my arm and yanked me down from the cab, nearly dislocating my shoulder in the process. They made me stand facing my truck while they cut the cable seals on the tarps, the sound of the bolt cutters echoing across the empty fields. One of them climbed up on the trailer with some kind of handheld scanner, running it over each of the 3 shapes, while another guy typed on a military-grade laptop, balanced on the hood of their Suburban. The scanner started clicking like a Geiger counter, faster and faster as he moved it toward the middle container, and suddenly all 4 of them backed away from the trailer like it was about to explode. The guy with the neck tattoo got on his radio, speaking in some kind of code I couldn't follow, lots of numbers and letters that meant nothing to me, but his voice had gone from aggressive to genuinely scared. Within 10 minutes, the whole area turned into a circus, helicopters appearing from nowhere, more black vehicles streaming down the highway, guys in hazmat suits setting up some kind of perimeter around my truck. They put me in the back of one of the Suburbans, no handcuffs, but the door handles didn't work from the inside, and I sat there for 3 hours watching them work through the tinted windows. Nobody would answer my questions. Nobody would tell me what was in those containers. Just kept asking me the same things over and over. Who hired me? What route was I supposed to take? Did I stop anywhere that wasn't on the manifest? The guy with the neck tattoo finally came back, tossed my CDL and phone on the seat next to me, and told me I was free to go, but the truck and trailer were being impounded for national security reasons. They drove me to a motel in Garden City, paid for a week in advance, and told me not to leave town until someone contacted me. The next morning, Secured Transit Solutions' phone number was disconnected, their website gone, like they'd never existed at all. I tried calling Carla's direct line, but it just rang and rang with no voicemail. 3 weeks later, I saw it on the news while eating breakfast at a diner. An industrial explosion at a chemical plant in Nebraska. 4 dead, investigators finding traces of materials that matched the serial numbers from my impounded trailer. The FBI showed up at my door that same afternoon with a warrant, seized my laptop and all my paperwork, started asking about my connections to domestic terrorist groups, whether I knew what I was really hauling, why I deviated from the planned route when I hadn't deviated at all. My lawyer, a former JAG officer I found through a veterans group, managed to get the charges dropped after 8 months of pure hell, but by then the damage was done. Word had gotten around the trucking community that I was under federal investigation. Insurance companies wouldn't touch me, and nobody wanted to hire a driver who might bring that kind of heat to their operation. The lawyer dug up some interesting stuff, though. Secured Transit Solutions had been incorporated just 2 days before they contacted me, dissolved the day after my cargo got intercepted, and the address they'd given me led to an empty lot that had been vacant for years according to county records. The facility where I'd picked up the load had security footage, but somehow all the cameras had malfunctioned that morning, every single one, and the guard company had no record of ever providing personnel to that location. I still get calls sometimes, always from blocked numbers, asking if I remember anything else about that day, if I've talked to anyone about what happened, reminding me that my NDAs are still legally binding even though the company no longer exists. My wife thinks I should just forget about it, move on with our lives, maybe go back to school and learn a trade that doesn't involve driving. But late at night when I can't sleep, I keep thinking about those 3 containers and whatever was making that scanner go crazy, wondering if I was hauling something that ended up killing those people in Nebraska, or if maybe those men in the Suburbans saved a lot more lives by stopping me when they did. Either way, I know I'll never get answers, just like I know there's probably someone watching my house right now, making sure I keep my mouth shut about the whole thing, which is exactly what I've done until now, posting this from a library computer 2 states away, because I figure people deserve to know that sometimes your own government will use you, frame you, and throw you away without a second thought. Anyone who's driven a rig for a living knows the industry runs on 2 things: fuel and trust. When both start running low, you make decisions you wouldn't normally make. That's where I was in March of 2023. 41 years old with a small fleet of 3 trucks that were bleeding me dry on repairs. My best driver had just quit to work for one of the mega carriers, and I was staring down a month where I'd have to choose between making the insurance payment or keeping the trucks running. That's when I got the email from a broker I'd never heard of before, Westline Logistics, offering rates that were 30% higher than what I was used to seeing. The loads were overnight runs, always starting after 8 in the evening, always ending before dawn. The email said they specialized in time-sensitive freight for clients who valued discretion. I should have known better, but desperation has a way of making red flags look like opportunities. The first job seemed straightforward enough. Pick up a sealed container at a warehouse outside Louisville, drive it to a distribution center near Indianapolis, drop it off, collect payment. The paperwork looked legitimate, proper BOL, all the right stamps and signatures, even had dot numbers that checked out when I looked them up online. The weird part was the pickup itself. The warehouse was in an industrial zone that looked half abandoned, just one building with lights on in a sea of dark structures. A guy in a Westline Logistics jacket met me at the loading dock, wouldn't make eye contact, just handed me the keys to the container and told me the code for the lock. He made me sign a separate non-disclosure agreement right there on a clipboard, said it was standard procedure for sensitive cargo. I asked what was in the container, and he gave me this rehearsed line about proprietary manufacturing equipment. The whole interaction took maybe 5 minutes. I hooked up the container, checked the seals were intact like the paperwork specified, and headed out. The drive was quiet, just me and the highway and the nagging feeling that I should have asked more questions. The payment hit my account before I even made it back home, which never happens in this business. Usually you're waiting weeks for brokers to process payments, chasing down invoices, dealing with short pays and deductions. But Westline paid in full, plus a bonus for what they called professional discretion. That money kept my operation alive for another month. So when they emailed again a week later with another overnight run, same rate plus an extra $200 for fuel, I didn't hesitate. Then it became a pattern. Every week, sometimes twice a week, always overnight runs, always sealed containers, always different pickup and drop-off locations across the Midwest. The paperwork was always perfect, the payments always immediate. I started recognizing some of the warehouse locations, noticed they were always in these isolated industrial areas, where nobody would pay attention to truck traffic at odd hours. The loading dock workers were different each time, but they all had that same nervous energy, that same refusal to make conversation. One time I tried to make small talk with a guy who looked about 20, asked him how long he'd been working for Westline, and he just stared at me like I'd asked him to confess to a crime. He mumbled something about being a contractor and practically ran back inside. About 2 months in, I started noticing other trucks at these locations. Not the same trucks, but they all had something in common. They were owner-operators like me. Smaller outfits, guys running 1 or 2 rigs. I'd see them at the pickup points, waiting in the staging areas, and we'd do that trucker nod. That acknowledgement that we were all part of the same world. But nobody talked. There was this unspoken understanding that you didn't ask questions about Westline jobs. The money was too good, and we all needed it too badly. One night at a warehouse outside Dayton, I saw a Peterbilt that looked familiar. A custom paint job in deep blue with silver flames that I swear I'd seen at a truck stop months earlier. The driver was gone though, just the truck sitting there in the lot with its lights off. I remember thinking it was strange that someone would leave a rig that nice unattended, but I was already running late for my own pickup. I didn't think about it again until much later, when I should have been paying attention to all the small details that were adding up to something very wrong. The job that changed everything came on a Wednesday in early May. Westline sent me coordinates instead of an address, which was a first, along with instructions to arrive at exactly 11:30 at night, not earlier, not later. The location was way out in rural Pennsylvania, nearly 3 hours from where I'd made my last delivery. The route took me off the interstate onto progressively smaller roads until I was on a 2-lane county highway with nothing but farmland and woods on either side. My GPS kept trying to reroute me back to main roads, like it didn't believe this destination could be real. When I finally found the turnoff, it was just a gravel road with no sign, no mailbox, nothing to indicate what was back there. I checked the coordinates 3 times before I committed to turning in. The road went on for maybe half a mile through dense trees, and then suddenly opened up into this massive clearing with a chain-link fence topped with razor wire running the entire perimeter. There were sodium lights mounted on tall poles, bathing everything in that harsh orange glow that makes everything look like a crime scene. The gate was closed, and there were 2 men standing in front of it wearing security uniforms and carrying what I'm pretty sure were rifles, not just handguns. I stopped about 50 feet from the gate, engine idling, trying to figure out what kind of legitimate business operation needed this level of security in the middle of nowhere. One of the guards walked up to my window, shined a flashlight directly in my face, and asked for my name and confirmation number without any greeting or explanation. I gave him the information, and he walked back to a small guardhouse I hadn't noticed before, made a phone call, then came back and told me to proceed to loading dock 7. The gate rolled open with this grinding mechanical sound that seemed way too loud in the quiet night. As I drove through, I got my first real look at what was inside the fence, and that's when my chest started feeling tight. There were trucks everywhere. Not just a few, but dozens of them, lined up in neat rows like some kind of vehicle graveyard. Big rigs, day cabs, sleepers, all different makes and models, all just sitting there dark and empty. I recognized the blue Peterbilt immediately, parked in the 3rd row with 6 other trucks that looked just as well maintained and expensive. None of them looked abandoned or junked. They looked like they'd been driven there yesterday and parked carefully. The loading docks were along one side of the property, attached to a long metal building with no windows and no company name anywhere visible. I backed into dock 7 like I'd been instructed, but my mind was racing through every possible explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe it was a fleet storage facility. Maybe these were trucks being held for auction or repair. But that didn't explain the armed guards or the razor wire, or the complete absence of any identifying information. A man in a different uniform, not security but something like a supervisor, came out and knocked on my door. He had a tablet in his hand and that same avoidance of eye contact I'd seen from every other Westline worker. He told me to leave the engine running, exit the vehicle, and come inside to complete the paperwork. Something in his tone wasn't a request, it was an instruction, the kind you don't argue with. I climbed down from the cab, and he walked me through a metal door into a hallway that smelled like oil and something chemical I couldn't identify. The walls were bare concrete block, the floors were stained, and there were more cameras than I'd ever seen in any warehouse, mounted in every corner. Every doorway, all of them with little red lights indicating they were recording. He led me into a small office where another man was sitting behind a desk, older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a polo shirt with a Westline Logistics logo embroidered on it. The man behind the desk smiled at me, but it didn't reach his eyes. He gestured to a chair and said we needed to go over some additional documentation for this particular load. He slid a stack of papers across the desk, and I started reading through them, but the language was dense and confusing, full of legal terminology about asset transfers and equipment reassignment and liability waivers. I asked what this was about, why this job required different paperwork than the others, and he leaned back in his chair and said something that made every instinct in my body scream. He said that given the nature of the operation and the sensitive cargo I'd been transporting, they needed to ensure complete operational security going forward. I asked what he meant by going forward, and he just kept smiling that flat smile. Then he said that my truck would need to remain on the property for a standard safety inspection and equipment verification process that would take approximately 72 hours. I stood up and said that wasn't part of the agreement, that I had other deliveries scheduled, that I needed my truck. He didn't stand up, didn't raise his voice, just calmly said that the inspection was non-negotiable and outlined in the contract I'd signed 2 months ago. I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, and realized I had no signal. Not one bar. He noticed me checking and mentioned that the property had cellular interference due to the security systems. That's when I knew I wasn't leaving. I tried to keep my voice steady and asked if I could at least get my personal belongings from the cab. He nodded and said one of the security personnel would escort me. We walked back out to the loading dock, and the guard who came with me wasn't the friendly escort type. He stood close enough that I could smell his cologne, watching my every move as I grabbed my duffel bag, my logbook, and my wallet from inside the sleeper. That's when I noticed something that sent a jolt of pure panic through me. The VIN plate on my dashboard, the one that's riveted in place and never supposed to be removed, had a small scratch mark around the rivets, like someone had been measuring or photographing it. I looked at the guard and he was already staring at me, waiting for me to finish up. I grabbed what I could and let him walk me back inside, this time to a different part of the building. He opened a door to what looked like a break room, except there were 4 other guys in there, all of them with that same exhausted, trapped expression. One of them was wearing a Schneider Company shirt, another had a Cat Diesel power cap, all of them owner-operators by the look of it. The guard told me to wait there, that someone would bring me dinner and that I'd be called when my inspection was complete. Then he locked the door from the outside. The second the lock clicked, one of the men, heavy-set guy with a gray beard and wearing a worn denim jacket, looked at me and said, "How many runs did you do for them before they brought you here?" I told him maybe 15, 20 loads over 2 months. He shook his head and said he'd done 37 before they'd finally pulled him in. Another guy, younger with a southern accent and grease stains on his jeans, said he'd been in this room for 5 days. 5 days. I asked what they were doing with the trucks, and the man with the beard said exactly what I'd been afraid to think. They were stealing them, not through force but through paperwork. Every load we'd hauled had been legitimate enough to establish a pattern of trust. Meanwhile, they were collecting our information, our routes, our registration details, everything they needed to create false ownership documents. Once they had your truck on this property, they'd re-VIN it, forge new titles, and sell it off to chop shops or overseas buyers. As for the drivers, we'd signed NDAs and contracts so dense with legal language that we'd basically agreed to keep our mouths shut or face massive lawsuits. But more than that, they had documentation showing we'd willingly driven loads for them dozens of times, which meant if anyone went to the police, we'd look just as complicit. The younger guy said 2 drivers had already signed over their trucks rather than risk prosecution. They'd been given $5,000 cash and dropped off at a bus station with a story about selling their equipment to pay debts. Nobody would question it. Nobody would investigate, and the trucks would disappear into the black market like they'd never existed. I sat there for hours trying to figure out a way out that didn't end with me losing everything or worse. The man with the beard, his name was Glenn, said they'd already offered him the buyout that morning, and he was planning to take it because he couldn't afford a legal battle, and his truck had a lien on it anyway. But my situation was different. I owned my 3 trucks outright, no loans, and one of them was sitting in this compound about to be stolen. If I signed it over, I'd lose not just that truck, but my entire business. I'd have nothing left. Around 3 in the morning, a different guard brought in sandwiches and bottles of water, and I noticed he propped the door open while he set the food down, just for a few seconds. Didn't even bother to check if we were all accounted for. That's when I realized something important. They weren't treating us like kidnapping victims because legally we weren't. We'd driven here voluntarily, we'd signed paperwork, and we were being fed and housed. If anyone asked, they'd say we were in a contractual dispute over equipment. They were sloppy because they didn't think we'd run. But I also noticed something else. The guard's radio was clipped to his belt and it was set to an open channel. I could hear dispatch chatter. And more importantly, I heard one of the guards say he was heading to the north gate to let a transport truck out. When the guard left and locked us back in, I told the others what I'd heard, and that I thought the north side of the property might be less monitored if they were focused on moving trucks out. Glenn said there was no point, that the fence was too high and the guards had weapons. But the younger guy, his name was Joey, said he'd noticed ventilation grates in the bathroom that connected to some kind of ductwork. It was a long shot, but we were all desperate in different ways. Around 4 in the morning, when we heard vehicle sounds and voices outside indicating another truck was being moved, Joey and I went into the bathroom and pried open the vent cover with a belt buckle. The duct was narrow, but not impossible. It took us maybe 20 minutes of crawling through sheet metal and insulation before we came out in what looked like a storage area on the opposite side of the building. From there, we found a loading door that wasn't fully secured, just held by a chain with enough gap to squeeze through. We ran across the lot, staying between the parked trucks for cover, and when we reached the fence line, we used one of the trucks as a ladder to climb up and carefully get past the razor wire, using our jackets as protection. I cut my arm pretty badly, and Joey twisted his ankle landing on the other side, but we were out. We ran through the woods until we hit that county highway, and then kept walking until we found a house with lights on about 2 miles down the road. The people who lived there were an elderly couple who let us use their phone to call the state police. What happened next took months to fully unfold, but the short version is that the police raided the property within hours of our call and found exactly what we described. 43 trucks, all reported stolen or missing over the past 8 months, all with altered VINs and forged documentation. They arrested 12 people on site, including the man in the polo shirt who turned out to be running the entire operation under multiple shell companies. Westline Logistics didn't exist as a legitimate business. It was just a website and a forwarding address. The FBI got involved because the operation crossed state lines and involved identity theft on a massive scale. They'd been using our driver's licenses and DOT numbers to create fake profiles, then using those profiles to secure loans and lines of credit before disappearing. Glenn and the other 2 drivers who were still in that room when the raid happened were released immediately. My truck was recovered, though it took 6 weeks of legal paperwork to get it back, and I had to replace the entire VN plate assembly because they'd already started the alteration process. I lost 2 months of income dealing with depositions and insurance claims, and I'm still paying off the legal fees. Joey got his rig back too, though his had already been partially stripped for parts. The thing that still keeps me up some nights is thinking about how many drivers might have just taken the buyout and walked away, never reporting it, never knowing they were part of something this big. I see posts sometimes on trucking forums, guys complaining about shady brokers or missing equipment, and I always wonder if they crossed paths with the same operation or one like it. I run my own loads now, no brokers, no overnight mystery runs, even if it means lower pay. Trust isn't something I give out easily anymore, And every time I see a truck sitting abandoned at a warehouse or a too-good-to-be-true load offer, I remember that fence and those rows of stolen rigs and how close I came to being just another driver who vanished. Driving refrigerated pharmaceuticals doesn't sound dangerous until you're the one responsible for keeping insulin stable at precisely 38 degrees while crossing a mountain pass in a blizzard. My commercial license renewal came through that January of 2015, which meant I'd turned 26 somewhere between the Utah border and that nightmare convoy through Teton Pass. I'd been hauling for Bridger Medical Transport for nearly 3 years by then, mostly solo routes, because the premium pay helped chip away at my mom's mounting medical bills from her botched knee replacement. The teaching credential I'd abandoned 2 years earlier felt like someone else's life entirely, especially on nights when I'd pull into a truck stop at 3 in the morning with my muscles aching and my thermos empty. But the job was mine, earned through countless hours of practice backing into tight loading docks and memorizing weight distribution charts that other drivers couldn't be bothered to learn. The convoy assignment came through dispatch on a Monday afternoon while I was finishing a delivery in Salt Lake. 6 refrigerated trucks needed to push medical supplies north to Billings before a massive winter system locked down the mountain routes for potentially a week. Bridger only organized convoys during severe weather advisories, when the risk of a solo driver getting stranded with a frozen load outweighed the inefficiency of coordinated travel. A veteran driver named Howard Pembroke got tapped as road captain, someone whose gravelly voice I'd heard countless times on the CB coordinating movements and warning about speed traps. When we staged at the truck stop in Logan that afternoon, Howard walked the line of rigs doing his safety check, a stocky man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses that kept fogging up in the December cold. He stopped at my door, squinted up at my cab, and told me I'd be running sweep position at the rear of the convoy. His reasoning sounded solid enough at the time. My rig had the newest LED visibility array, and he wanted someone reliable watching for stragglers or mechanical failures. We rolled out just before sunset, which in December meant we'd be climbing into darkness by the time we hit the Sirius elevation. The convoy stretched ahead of me like a string of red taillights, each rig maintaining the mandatory 50-yard gap that Howard had drilled into us during the briefing. My CB crackled with periodic check-ins as we climbed, drivers calling out their positions and confirming their reefer units were holding temperature. The road was already getting bad, that kind of packed snow that turns to ice under your tires and makes every slight turn feel like a negotiation with physics. I kept my speed steady, my hands loose on the wheel the way my instructor had taught me during training, and tried not to think about the 16 pallets of insulin and antibiotics riding behind me. The pharmaceutical loads were always the worst for stress because you knew that somewhere down the line, actual human beings were counting on that shipment arriving intact and on schedule. About 40 minutes into the climb, one of the trucks near the front started having issues. I could hear it on the CB before I could see anything. A driver named Carl, reporting that his reefer unit was showing temperature fluctuations. Howard's voice came back immediately, calm and methodical, telling Carl to maintain speed and keep monitoring while he figured out if we needed to stop for a mechanical check. That's when I noticed the truck directly in front of me, a navy blue Freightliner with mud flaps that read Summit Freight, starting to tap its brakes more than necessary. Not the gentle pressure you'd use on a downhill grade, but these weird, irregular jabs that made the brake lights flare bright and then dim in a pattern that didn't match the road conditions. I clicked my CB to call it out, but before I could speak, Howard's voice filled the channel again, this time directing all drivers to tighten up the gaps because visibility was dropping fast with the snow coming down harder. The Summit Freight truck hit its brakes hard about 10 minutes later, not a tap this time but a full stop that had me downshifting fast to avoid rear-ending him. My rig shuddered as I brought it down, the weight of the load pushing against my deceleration, and I watched the Freightliner's driver's side mirror as it swung wide and pulled off onto a narrow turnout carved into the rock face. The turnout wasn't marked as an official rest area, just a widened shoulder that maintenance crews probably used for equipment storage. Before I could process what was happening, the driver leaned out his window and waved me forward with these big, exaggerated arm movements like I was supposed to follow him in there. My gut told me to keep rolling, to click the CB and ask Howard what the protocol was for a truck-breaking convoy formation. But the Freightliner was completely blocking my lane now, and the shoulder was the only place with enough room to get around him safely. I pulled in, my headlights sweeping across the turnout and illuminating something that made my chest tighten. 2 more trucks were already parked there, tucked back against the rock wall in positions that suggested they'd been waiting rather than stopping for an emergency. Both were running, exhaust pluming white in the cold air, and as my rig came to a complete stop, a 3rd truck pulled in behind me, effectively boxing me into a space barely large enough for 4 rigs. The drivers emerged almost simultaneously, 3 men in heavy Carhartt jackets and insulated gloves, their faces ruddy from the cold, but their expressions hard and focused in a way that had nothing to do with weather concerns. The one from the Freightliner, a tall guy with a graying goatee, approached my driver's side while the other 2 flanked my passenger side and rear. I rolled my window down maybe 3 inches, enough to hear him but not enough to make myself vulnerable, and he immediately launched into an accusation that caught me completely off guard. He said I'd cut into his lane about 20 miles back, that I'd forced him to brake hard and nearly sent him into the guardrail. And that kind of reckless driving in convoy formation was exactly the type of thing that got people killed on mountain passes. I genuinely had no memory of cutting anyone off, and I told him so through the narrow gap in my window, keeping my voice level, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. He didn't seem interested in my explanation. Instead, he pulled out a small notepad, the kind drivers use to log fuel stops, and said that given the severity of the incident and the risk I'd posed to the entire convoy, he needed to see my key cargo certificate and manifest. His tone had shifted into something official sounding, like he was conducting a legitimate safety inspection. And when I hesitated, one of the other drivers, a shorter guy with a red face and a thick neck, moved closer to my passenger door and rapped his knuckles against the window. The sound was loud enough to make me jump. The tall one kept talking, saying that Summit Freight had contracted with Bridger before, and they knew the protocol for reporting unsafe drivers, that if I cooperated now they could handle this between professionals without involving the highway patrol or my company's safety department. He wanted me to open the trailer for a visual inspection of my load, just to confirm I was maintaining proper temperature and hadn't compromised the shipment with my erratic driving. Everything about the request was wrong. Drivers don't inspect each other's loads on the side of the road, especially not in the middle of a blizzard on a mountain pass. Cargo certificates stay with the driver and only get shown to authorized personnel at weigh stations or delivery points. But I was alone, surrounded by 3 rigs and 4 men who clearly had coordinated this stop, and the wind was picking up in a way that made the temperature inside my cab drop every time it whistled through the window gap. I reached for my CB handset, intending to call Howard and report the situation, and that's when the tall driver did something that made the whole scene crystallize into focus. He reached up to his own shoulder mic, clicked it on, and broadcast over the convoy channel in this smooth, reasonable voice that there was a safety check in progress at mile marker 73, minor traffic incident being documented, and all other drivers should maintain course and speed to Billings. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that Howard should continue leading the main group and not wait up because weather conditions were deteriorating fast. Howard's voice came back within seconds, acknowledging the message and confirming that the convoy would proceed as planned. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical weight. These men had access to the convoy frequency, knew the protocols well enough to mimic legitimate safety procedures, and had just successfully isolated me from any help using the very chain of command that was supposed to protect us. I sat there with the handset still in my grip, watching the tall driver's face through my partially open window, and saw the shift in his expression from pseudo-professional to something colder and more calculating. He told me they'd heard about a Bridger rig that had gone missing earlier that week, somewhere between Idaho and Wyoming, a full load of high-value pharmaceuticals that never made it to its destination and was currently listed as stolen in every law enforcement database from here to the Canadian border. His company, he said, had a client expecting a delivery that couldn't happen now because of that theft, and my manifest showed I was carrying exactly the kind of product mix that could substitute for what they'd lost. The math was simple. I could hand over my cargo certificate, open my trailer, and let them offload half my pallets to cover their shortage, or I could refuse and deal with the consequences of a formal safety violation report that would go directly to Bridger's compliance office. The threat wasn't even subtle. The red-faced driver moved around to my driver's side, standing close enough that I could see the water vapor from his breath fogging against my mirror. He laid out exactly what would happen if I didn't cooperate. They'd file a detailed incident report claiming I'd engaged in aggressive driving, failed to maintain proper following distance, and refused to allow a safety inspection of my refrigeration unit. They had dashboard camera footage, he said, or at least they'd claim to have it, and with 3 drivers willing to provide matching statements against my word alone, Bridger would have no choice but to suspend my license pending investigation. Even if I eventually got cleared, which could take months, I'd lose my current route assignments, my safety bonus, and any chance of getting premium pharmaceutical runs in the future. The tall one pulled out his phone, showed me a screen with what looked like a formal complaint form already partially filled out with my truck number and license plate, and said all it would take was 1 click to submit it through the industry safety reporting system. They knew I couldn't afford that kind of hit to my record, not with my mom's medical bills piling up and my entire income dependent on maintaining a clean driving history. My satellite phone was dead, battery drained from the cold after I'd forgotten to bring it inside during my last rest stop. The CB was useless now that they'd already established their narrative with Howard, and even if I could reach him, what was I supposed to say that wouldn't sound like excuses from a driver who'd legitimately screwed up? The wind was howling through the gap in my window, and I could feel the temperature in my cab dropping degree by degree, while these men stood outside in their insulated gear, perfectly comfortable waiting for me to brake. I looked past them at the wall of rock on one side and the steep drop on the other, both barely visible through the thickening snow. The third driver, who hadn't spoken yet, walked back to his truck and returned with a set of bolt cutters, not threatening me with them directly, but just holding them casually while he leaned against my trailer door. The message was clear. I could open it voluntarily, or they'd open it themselves and add destruction of property to their fictional incident report. My hands were shaking now. Not from fear exactly, but from this sick combination of rage and helplessness that comes from knowing you're being robbed in slow motion, and there's not a single person coming to help you. But then something shifted in my head, a moment of clarity that cut through the panic. These men were drivers, which meant they were on a schedule just like me, and this mountain pass was going to be completely impassable within the next few hours, based on the weather reports I'd checked before leaving Logan. They needed this done fast, which meant they were banking on me being too scared or too exhausted to call their bluff. I rolled my window down another inch, just enough to make eye contact with the tall one, and told him in the steadiest voice I could manage that I needed to see his operating authority number and his company's safety rating documentation before I'd even consider opening my trailer. It was a completely reasonable request under actual DOT regulations, the kind of thing any driver should be able to produce instantly if they're legitimately affiliated with a registered carrier. His face changed immediately, that professional mask slipping just enough for me to see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He started to respond, probably with another threat, but I cut him off and said I was also going to need the incident time-stamped and location verified through the convoy's GPS coordination system, which Bridger monitored in real time for all pharmaceutical loads. That part was partially a bluff, since I wasn't entirely sure how closely dispatch actually watched our GPS pings during active runs, but it was enough to plant doubt. The 3 men exchanged glances, and I watched the dynamic shift in real time. The red-faced one stepped back from my passenger door, his aggressive posture deflating slightly. The tall driver with the goatee tried to maintain control, launching into another explanation about how they were all registered carriers with Summit Freight, and this was standard procedure for convoy incidents. But his voice had lost that authoritative edge. I interrupted him again, louder this time, and said that if this was legitimate, then he wouldn't have any problem with me documenting everything on my dashboard camera and uploading it to Bridger's incident server before we proceeded. I didn't actually have a functioning dashboard camera. The mount had broken 2 months earlier, and I'd been too broke to replace it. But he had no way of knowing that. I reached for my sun visor like I was adjusting a camera angle and watched his face go through this rapid series of calculations. The wind hammered against my rig hard enough to rock it slightly, and I could see fresh snow accumulating on their shoulders and hoods at a rate that meant the pass was going to be undrivable within the hour. They were running out of time and they knew it. The tall one made one final attempt, his voice hardening as he said I was making a serious mistake by being uncooperative, that I clearly didn't understand how the industry worked or what happened to drivers who got reputations as troublemakers. But even as he said it, he was already backing toward his Freightliner, and the other two were moving toward their own rigs. The whole confrontation had lasted maybe 15 minutes, though it had felt like hours. And now they were retreating because the risk calculation had shifted against them. If I actually had cameras, if dispatch actually was monitoring my GPS closely, if I actually followed through on documenting their operating authority and filing my own report, then they'd be the ones facing scrutiny instead of me. The third driver with the bolt cutters tossed them into his cab and slammed the door without looking back. Within 2 minutes, all 3 trucks had fired up their engines, maneuvered out of the turnout in a chaos of reversing and repositioning that nearly put one of them into the ditch, and disappeared up the mountain road ahead of me. I sat there alone in the turnout with my engine idling, and my whole body shaking from adrenaline dump, watching their taillights fade into the white curtain of snow until there was nothing left but the howling wind and the knowledge that I'd just barely avoided something that could have destroyed everything I'd worked for. I waited another 5 minutes to make sure they were really gone, then pulled back onto the highway and drove the rest of the pass at maybe 20 miles per hour. My hands welded to the steering wheel and my mind replaying every moment of that encounter on an endless loop. I never saw those trucks again, never heard their voices on the CB, and when I finally rolled into the Billings distribution center 8 hours later, exhausted and wired and still half convinced they might be waiting for me somewhere, my load was intact, and my manifest was clean, and nobody at Bridger ever knew how close they'd come to losing an entire shipment to a coordinated theft, disguised as a safety check. When you spend most nights alone on the interstate, you start to see things differently. I'd been hauling refrigerated freight for almost a year back then, running long stretches through the Midwest. My routine was simple: music low, thermos of coffee within reach, and a habit of counting mile markers to stay awake. That night the sky was heavy with clouds, no moon at all, and the air felt damp like it might rain. I was between loads, heading toward an industrial park to pick up medical supplies scheduled for early morning delivery. Everything about the drive felt ordinary until I saw the figure standing on the shoulder, waving both arms. At first I thought it was a trick of the headlights, but the shape didn't move away. I slowed and saw a young woman in jeans and a gray hoodie, hair sticking to her face from the wind. She looked terrified, eyes darting toward the trees like she expected someone to come out of them. I pulled onto the gravel, keeping the rig's hazards flashing, and she ran up to the door before I could even roll the window down. "Please, my car died," she said, voice cracking. She was shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. Against better judgment, I unlocked the passenger side and let her in to warm up. She smelled faintly of diesel and some sharp chemical scent I couldn't place. While I dialed for roadside assistance, she kept thanking me, saying most drivers just sped past. Her name, she said, was Tara. She worked part-time at a lab in the city and had been driving back after a late shift when her car broke down. I believed her. She looked exhausted, pale under the dash light. We made small talk about night driving, gas prices, the weather, but every few seconds she glanced toward the console where my dispatch papers sat. I didn't think much of it until she quietly slipped one folded sheet into her jacket pocket. I caught the motion in the corner of my eye. "Hey, what are you doing?" I asked. She froze for a split second, then laughed it off, saying she thought the paper was hers. I didn't push it, I just wanted to drop her at the next safe spot. A few miles later, I pulled into a way station that was closed for the night. Lights on, nobody there. The moment I stopped, she changed. Her polite tone vanished. "I can't get out," she said flatly. "Not yet." Then she reached into her bag and took out 2 small vials wrapped in gauze. "I need to deliver these. It's urgent. 2 exits ahead." At first, I thought she was joking. I told her there was no way I was driving anywhere without knowing what was inside those vials. She pressed her thumb against one of the labels, and I saw the print blur. It wasn't even sealed properly. "They're medical samples," she said, eyes locked on mine. "Just fluids, nothing dangerous, I swear." I told her I'd call a tow truck for her car, and maybe she could explain everything to the cops when they showed up. That's when her whole demeanor shifted. She unzipped her hoodie and pulled out her phone, flipping the screen toward me. It showed a map of my route, my carrier name, and my home address in bold letters. She must have noticed how I looked at the screen because she smiled. Not the friendly kind. "You're not really in a position to say no," she said softly. "You're marked as the driver on this load. If I make one call, your log shows tampering, maybe even cargo interference." My throat tightened. I asked her how she got that information, and she told me there were people who monitored sympathetic drivers, those who picked up strangers, offered rides, or helped stranded motorists. "You're exactly who we look for," she said. "Decent, predictable." The words made me feel smaller with each syllable. She started explaining things I didn't want to know. How courier rings moved unregistered biomedical material between private labs. How sometimes they lost couriers, so they used helpers, regular drivers, unaware at first, then pressured later. She said those who refused were blacklisted. "It's easy," she went on. "All they have to do is file a report. 1 ELD discrepancy, 1 missing scan, and your company dumps you." She said it like she'd done it before. I remember gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, trying to keep my breathing steady. I told her to get out. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned back and crossed her arms like she owned the cab. The only sound was the hum of the refrigeration unit outside. My hazard lights blinked red across her face every few seconds, like a metronome counting down. I tried reasoning, told her she could walk, that I wouldn't tell anyone. She said she'd already sent messages to her people, sharing my truck number and location. "You can't disappear," she added quietly. "You drive on public roads. You leave a trail every day." For the first time in my life, I wished the way station wasn't so empty. I sat there for what felt like forever, headlights sweeping past from the highway now and then, each one briefly lighting her face. I knew if I panicked, I'd lose control of the situation completely. So I did the only thing I could think of. I played along. I told her fine, I'd take her 2 exits down. I turned the rig back on, pretending to adjust the GPS, but I was actually opening the camera app on my phone, trying to record without her noticing. She kept checking her messages, whispering under her breath like someone was giving her directions. I merged back onto the highway, my pulse so loud it drowned out the engine. When we reached the next exit, she pointed toward a narrow frontage road that cut behind a cluster of old warehouses. The lights ahead were dim and yellow, flickering like they hadn't been replaced in years. "There," she said, and I could see a black SUV idling by a dumpster, no plates visible. I slowed down but didn't stop completely. Instead, I told her the brakes were acting up and that I needed to roll forward a bit before I parked. As soon as she looked toward the windshield, I hit the air horn, long and loud. The SUV's headlights flashed, and whoever was inside backed away fast, startled. In that instant, she yelled at me to stop, but I threw the truck into gear and kept going. She screamed something about ruining everything, but I barely heard her. A few miles down, I pulled into a brightly lit rest stop where a couple of other drivers were parked. She tried to open the door, but the handle jammed. child lock still on. I shouted for one of the guys outside to call the police. When she realized people were watching, she stopped shouting and went eerily calm, tucking the vials back into her jacket like nothing had happened. By the time the state trooper arrived, she'd changed her story again, said I'd offered to smuggle things for her and then turned on her. But I had the video, even if it was shaky and half dark. They took her away after checking her ID. Apparently it didn't match any real record. The trooper told me to keep my doors locked and file a report with my company immediately. For weeks after, I expected someone to call, or for those people to show up at a fuel stop somewhere, but nothing ever came of it. The company said there was no record of any complaint, no sign anyone had tried to access my ELD logs. Still, I changed routes and never stopped for anyone again. Sometimes late at night when I pass an empty shoulder, I think about that first glimpse of her under the headlights. I used to think helping strangers made the road a little less lonely. Now, I just keep driving. I've been driving long-haul routes for nearly 15 years, mostly through the Midwest. Back then, I had a habit of stopping at the same small rest area off I-70. Nothing big, just 2 gas pumps, a diner with 5 booths, and a vending machine that always ate my quarters. The kind of place you remember because it breaks up the monotony of endless miles. I'd been there maybe a dozen times over the years, enough for the waitress to start recognizing me. Her name was Lila, I think, red hair tied up with a pencil, and that habit of humming old country tunes while refilling coffee. That week started like any other. I left St. Clair County before dawn, planning to make it to Denver by nightfall. Around mid-morning, I reached the exit where the rest stop always sat. The big blue sign that used to say, "Fuel, Food, Restrooms" was gone. At first, I thought maybe construction crews were redoing the entrance, but when I pulled in, the asphalt was cracked and overgrown. The gas station canopy still stood, but the pumps were missing entirely, just metal stubs jutting from concrete like broken teeth. I parked the truck, got out, and stood there for a minute trying to piece it together. The diner windows were boarded up from the inside. The menu sign faded into a ghost of its old self. No tire marks, no trash, no evidence anyone had been there in months. Even the air felt still, like the whole place had been vacuum sealed. I walked around back, half expecting to find a closed for renovation notice, but there wasn't a trace. Just silence and wind whistling through an empty ice freezer. Confused, I decided to stop at the next town a few miles down the highway. I pulled into a small diner off Main Street, grabbed a coffee, and asked the lady behind the counter what happened to the rest area down the road. She looked at me like I'd asked about a dream. Said she'd lived there her whole life and never heard of any rest stop near that exit. When I tried explaining where it used to be, she laughed softly and said maybe I was mixing it up with somewhere else. But I knew that stretch of road like the back of my hand. I couldn't shake the weirdness. After finishing my coffee, I went back to the truck and pulled up my GPS history. Sure enough, it showed multiple stops at those same coordinates over the years. I even remembered refueling there last time, just a few months earlier. I had a receipt from the gas pump tucked in my logbook. When I checked, it was still there. The station's name, a timestamp, even the same exit number. But when I tried looking up the company online, there wasn't a single record of it. No listing, no business registration, nothing on Google Maps. Just a blank spot surrounded by farmland. That night, parked at a truck stop outside Hayes, I started scrolling through old dashcam footage. It took a while, but I found a clip from a previous trip, clear as day, pulling into that exact rest area. You could see the diner's red neon sign flickering, a guy in coveralls fueling up his pickup, and that same blue logo on the gas canopy. But when I paused the frame and zoomed in, something about the background bothered me. There weren't any highway signs visible, no mile markers, no exit numbers, just darkness beyond the lot, like the whole thing existed in its own pocket of space. The next morning, I called the state highway department, hoping maybe it had been shut down for safety reasons. The operator checked their database and said there were only 2 official rest areas along that section of I-70, and neither matched the one I described. She even emailed me a map to prove it. I mentioned the receipt, but she said counterfeit branding isn't unheard of, and that I should contact the state police if I thought something shady was involved. That word, counterfeit, stuck with me the rest of the drive. So later that afternoon, I stopped by a patrol office off the interstate. The officer on duty, Sergeant Hill, listened to my story without interrupting. When I showed him the receipt and dashcam clip, he leaned closer to the screen, his expression tightening. He asked me to forward the footage to a specific email, then told me quietly that I wasn't the first driver to bring up a disappearing rest area. Apparently, others had reported similar locations. Fake truck stops popping up overnight, built by organized groups trying to skim electronic logs and cargo manifests from long-haul rigs. Sergeant Hill explained that the setup was sophisticated. These groups would scout quiet stretches of interstate, rent or buy old lots, and reconstruct fake rest stops with stolen signage and used equipment. They even installed dummy fuel pumps wired to hidden devices that read ELD ports when drivers connected for receipts or Wi-Fi. It looked legitimate enough. Logos, uniforms, receipts, everything. Then, when they had enough data, they'd target certain trucks carrying high-value cargo. By the time police got wind of it, the entire operation would vanish overnight, dismantled piece by piece before dawn. When I asked how they could pull it off without anyone noticing, he said they used stolen construction permits and unregistered trucks, working mostly after midnight. Locals thought it was state maintenance or contractors putting up a new facility. By the time daylight came, it looked like a normal, open rest stop. Then one night they'd load everything back up and disappear, leaving only concrete and weeds. Hill said they'd raided a few similar sites before, but most were wiped clean before evidence teams arrived. Driving home later that week, I passed that same exit again. I slowed down, staring at the empty lot, and for a second, I swore I saw faint tire tracks leading into the grass. Not fresh, but not completely gone either. The diner's outline was still visible under the dust, like a ghost shadow of where it once stood. I didn't stop. I just kept rolling west, the silence in the cab louder than the hum of the engine. I couldn't stop thinking about how many other places like that might still be out there, waiting for another driver to pull in. I've kept that receipt ever since, tucked in my glove compartment. The logo's faded now, the ink bleeding from heat and time, but it's proof, at least to me, that the place existed. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe I was one of the last people to ever see it before it disappeared for good. Either way, I don't stop anywhere that isn't on an official highway list anymore. You learn to trust your instincts on the road, but after that day I also learned to trust the map more than my memory. Name's Aaron Mitchell, and for the last few years I've run a refrigerated rig hauling boxed beef and poultry into grocery chain distribution docks. Life on the road turned into a routine I could manage. Pre-trip at dawn, coffee that tastes like cardboard, and the white noise of the reefer humming behind me like a generator in a distant room. Bills got paid, mileage stacked up, and I kept my head down. That particular morning began like any other. Clean BOL, seal number noted. Temperatures steady at set point. The air carried that cold, metallic smell when you crack the trailer doors a sliver to check frost on the chute. Nothing exotic about the route, nothing unusual about dispatch. Still, a thought kept pinging the back of my mind. The last 2 drops had shown weights a little lighter than what I'd scanned. Not a huge gap, just enough to raise an eyebrow. The seal on today's load looked fine at first glance, same color, same serial format. But the crimp had a tiny burr, like someone closed it with a tool that didn't belong to it. My notes from prior runs showed a different style of crimp entirely. Inside the trailer, the air felt too crisp for the temp reading on the unit. The probe said one number, my breath said another. The data line on the ELD recorded a short stop the night before, at a location I didn't recognize, just a code where a city tag usually lives. Dispatch brushed it off as a ping glitch when I called. telling me to make my window and quit worrying. I kept rolling toward the first dock, repeating the seal number out loud, trying to anchor it in my head. Little things matter with a reefer: weights, temps, seals. And today, the little things didn't quite line up. At the distribution yard, I backed into a door next to another reefer rig I'd seen on this route a handful of times. The driver climbed down. Caleb Foster, mid-30s, ball cap with a frayed brim, the kind of guy who keeps his gloves clipped to his belt so he never loses them. We traded quick hellos while the dock light went red. He mentioned his paperwork showed a shrink on the last run that didn't match what he'd scanned. I joked about ghost pallets, and he didn't laugh. When his turn came to open up, he pointed at his seal. Same color as mine, same serial style, same odd burr on the crimp. We compared BOLs right there on the bumper, and a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the trailer. His recorded gross and my recorded gross were mirror images, like someone swapped items between two nearly identical loads. We pulled our ELD temp graphs and laid the phones side by side on the dock plate. Both showed a tiny temperature ripple around the same time overnight. Less than a degree, barely a hiccup, but visible if you knew how to read the slope. His log, like mine, had that mysterious stop code with no location tag, sandwiched between miles that should have been continuous. The receiving clerk called out that my door was going green, but I held back. If we swung the doors and something didn't match, it would be on us. We asked for a supervisor and requested a witnessed break of the seal with a scale ticket at the dock. The clerk frowned, made a call, and came back with a new tone in his voice. "You two wait here." The dock light stayed stubbornly red, and the hum of the building felt suddenly louder, like we'd stepped into a machine that just noticed us. After nearly 20 minutes, a man in a reflective vest appeared, clipboard in hand, with a tight expression like someone who'd just stepped into a problem he didn't want. He asked for our paperwork, then told us both to stay put while he made a few calls. Through the window, I watched him talk to a warehouse manager and another guy in a collared shirt with no badge, just a visitor pass clipped sideways. They kept glancing at our trucks like we were part of something bigger than a missing pallet. The other drivers unloading around us looked uneasy. One muttered that corporate had been running new suppliers lately. Nobody seemed to know where those suppliers were based. When they finally broke the seals under witness, the trailer smelled wrong. Not spoiled exactly, just metallic and sharp, the way a slaughterhouse alley does on a humid day. The boxes near the back looked fine, but halfway in, markings started to change. Some cartons had inked stamps that didn't match USDA print specs. One even had the font misaligned. Caleb's load showed the same irregularities. We filmed what we could before being told to stop. The warehouse manager's voice turned clipped, asking if we'd tampered with anything. He mentioned the possibility of contamination reports. I could tell the tone had shifted from concern to accusation. We were told to park and wait for further instructions. No one said who would be giving them. By late afternoon, a couple of unmarked sedans pulled up, and two men in suits started photographing both rigs, including license plates. One of them asked if I'd signed for my seals personally, as if I'd forged them myself. Caleb tried to reason with them, explaining how dispatch assigned the loads sealed and documented. They barely acknowledged him. Within an hour, we were escorted off the dock, told the loads were being held pending inspection. My company called soon after, flat tone, corporate speak, saying all deliveries for that supplier were temporarily suspended. 2 days later, the story broke on a regional news site. "Drivers accused in meat tampering scandal," the headline said, with our truck numbers blurred just enough to avoid legal risk, but clear enough for anyone who knew us to recognize. The article claimed an investigation uncovered uninspected product distributed through unauthorized channels, tied to unlicensed slaughterhouses posing as USDA-certified facilities. The kicker was that the logistics company, our employer, collapsed almost overnight. Website offline, dispatch phones disconnected, payroll frozen. The whole thing vanished like it had never existed. Caleb texted me that night. "We were just delivery hands. How do we end up the villains?" The following week, state inspectors reached out for statements. They wanted to know when I'd first noticed irregularities, who had loaded the trailers, and whether I'd seen any third-party tags. I told them everything: the mismatched seals, the off readings, the duplicate stops on the logs. They listened, nodded, and promised follow-up. But the official report that came out later barely mentioned the drivers. It framed the entire thing as logistical oversight, implying we'd missed standard checks. No mention of counterfeit suppliers, no acknowledgement that the dispatch system had been rerouting data to fake coordinates. They needed scapegoats to make the story neat for the evening news, and two haulers fit the role perfectly. Caleb tried to find a lawyer, but every firm he contacted dropped him once they realized how messy the case was. I filed unemployment and waited for someone to tell me what came next. Weeks passed in silence. Every time I heard a reefer unit start up on a passing truck, it felt like a reminder of how quickly something ordinary can turn into evidence. One afternoon, a man in plain clothes came by my apartment with a card that had no department name, just a phone number. He said off the record that investigators had traced the missing product to warehouse shells leased under fake business names. The people behind it had scrubbed their trail so clean that even the leasing agents didn't know who paid them. Months later, I started hauling again for a smaller outfit, sticking mostly to regional runs. I still check every seal twice, compare serials to the log, and avoid night pickups whenever possible. Sometimes I think about how easy it was for an entire operation to exist in plain sight, using drivers like me as camouflage. Those counterfeit seals were the perfect disguise, small, ordinary details that no one questions until the numbers stop adding up. I kept one of them, the one from that last run, sealed in a plastic bag inside my glove box. A reminder that trust on the road isn't guaranteed, not even from the company whose name is painted on your trailer. I've told this story a few times, mostly to rookies at truck stops who think the scariest part of the job is fatigue or bad weather. They laugh until they realize how quiet the industry gets when something like this happens. The truth is, the most dangerous thing out here isn't what's on the road. It's what hides behind paperwork that looks official. I used to think I understood the business I worked in. Now, every manifest feels like a mystery waiting to unfold, one barcode at a time. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The drive to Colorado was supposed to help us heal. My sister Natalie and I had lost our mother to cancer 6 months earlier, and the silence in our hometown had become unbearable. Every corner, every coffee shop, every familiar face reminded us of her absence. Natalie suggested we take 2 weeks off work and just drive. No real destination, just movement. We packed her old Subaru with snacks, playlists from our teenage years, and enough clothes to last us through whatever weather we might encounter. That Tuesday in early October, we found ourselves on a particularly desolate stretch of highway, somewhere in Kansas. The kind where you could drive for an hour without seeing another car. The sun was setting, painting the endless wheat fields in shades of copper and rust, and we both knew we needed to stop soon. The Restway Inn appeared like a mirage after another 40 minutes of nothing but asphalt and dying daylight. It wasn't much to look at. A single-story building with maybe 20 rooms, faded yellow paint peeling off the walls, and a flickering neon sign missing half its letters. But the parking lot had 3 other cars, which meant it was still in business, and the vacancy sign glowed a promising red. Natalie pulled into a spot near the office, and we sat there for a moment, both of us taking in the place. The office window had a handwritten sign that said, "Ring bell for service," next to an ancient-looking doorbell that had been painted over at least 4 times. An old woman appeared after the 3rd ring, moving slowly behind the glass, her gray hair in curlers despite it being past 8 in the evening. She checked us in without many words. just handed us a key attached to a plastic diamond-shaped tag with Room 12 etched into it. The room was at the far end of the building, and as we walked there, dragging our overnight bags, I noticed how quiet everything was. No traffic sounds, no television noise from other rooms, just the crunch of gravel under our feet. Room 12 smelled like old carpet and cherry air freshener trying too hard to mask something else. The beds were twins, separated by a nightstand with a lamp that belonged in someone's grandmother's estate sale. The bedspreads were this aggressive floral pattern in burgundy and green that probably hadn't been changed since the 80s. Natalie claimed the bed near the bathroom, tossing her bag onto it and immediately checking her phone for signal. 2 bars, barely enough. I took the bed by the window, which had thick curtains and a fabric that matched absolutely nothing else in the room. We ordered pizza from the only place that delivered out there, some local joint called Tony's, and spent the evening talking about everything except Mom. Around 11, exhaustion finally caught up with us. Natalie was snoring within minutes of turning off her lamp, that familiar sound that used to annoy me when we shared a room as kids but now felt comforting in this strange place. I woke up around 3 in the morning with that disoriented feeling you get in unfamiliar rooms, where it takes a few seconds to remember where you are. The room was darker than dark, that complete absence of light you only get far from cities. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I could make out the shape of Natalie's bed, the bulk of the dresser against the wall, and then I saw him. At the foot of my bed, sitting on the corner like he was visiting someone in a hospital, was an older man. He wore a plaid shirt, the kind with pearl snap buttons in browns and oranges that I could somehow distinguish despite the darkness. His hair was white and combed back with something that made it shine slightly, maybe pomade or some old-fashioned hair cream. He had deep lines around his eyes, the kind you get from squinting in the sun for decades, and his hands were folded in his lap, patient and still. He was just watching me, not threatening, not moving, just sitting there like he was keeping vigil. My body wouldn't move at first, that sleep paralysis feeling where your brain is awake but your muscles haven't gotten the message yet. I managed to blink hard several times, expecting him to disappear like those shadowy figures you sometimes see when you're half awake. But he remained, solid and real as the bed I was lying in. His breathing was quiet but visible, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He had a scar on his left hand, a pale line that ran from his thumb to his wrist, and he wore a wedding ring, simple gold band, worn thin from years of never taking it off. The strangest part was how calm he seemed, like he belonged there, like this was his routine. I finally found my voice, or thought I did, but what came out was barely a whisper asking what he wanted. He tilted his head slightly, as if he heard me, but didn't respond, just kept that steady, patient gaze fixed on me. I must have blinked or looked away for just a second because suddenly, he was gone. Not gone like he'd walked away. The door hadn't opened. There were no footsteps, no sound of movement at all. The corner of my bed where he'd been sitting didn't even have an indentation in the mattress. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs, and fumbled for the lamp switch. The sudden yellow light filled the room, showing me exactly what I expected. Nothing. Natalie was still snoring, completely undisturbed. I got up and checked the door, still locked from the inside, the chain still in place. The window was sealed shut, painted over so many times it probably hadn't opened in years. I even looked in the bathroom, behind the shower curtain, in the narrow closet. Nobody. I spent the rest of the night sitting up against the headboard with every light in the room on, watching infomercials on the ancient television, and jumping at every small sound from outside. When morning finally came, Natalie woke up stretching and yawning, completely oblivious to my night of terror. I told her about the man while she was brushing her teeth, describing every detail I could remember. The plaid shirt with those pearl snap buttons, the white hair slicked back, that scar on his hand. She listened with that half-interested way siblings do when they think you're being dramatic, suggesting maybe I'd had a nightmare or sleep paralysis. But I knew the difference between a dream and what I'd experienced. The way he'd sat there, the weight of his presence, the specific details like the worn wedding ring and the way his collar was slightly askew on the left side. Dreams don't have that kind of mundane specificity. Natalie said we should get breakfast and get back on the road, and I agreed, eager to put distance between myself and room 12. We packed quickly, returned the key to the same elderly woman who barely acknowledged us, and drove about 5 miles down the highway to a small diner called Bev's Kitchen. The diner was one of those timeless places with cracked vinyl booths and a counter with spinning stools that squeaked when you turned. Our waitress, a woman in her 40s with bleached hair and a name tag reading Donna, took our order with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for decades. While we waited for our pancakes and eggs, I found myself telling her about our stay at the Restway Inn, partly making conversation and partly hoping for some kind of explanation. When I mentioned the man in my room, describing his plaid shirt and white hair, Donna's hand stopped mid-pour as she was refilling my coffee. She set the pot down carefully and asked me to describe him again. So I did. The pearl snap buttons, the pomaded hair, the scar on his left hand running from thumb to wrist, the thin gold wedding band. Donna's face went pale under her makeup, and she glanced around the mostly empty diner before leaning in closer to our table. "That sounds exactly like Walter Brennan," she said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Used to come in here every Sunday after church with his wife Eleanor. Always ordered the same thing. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through it for a moment before showing us a photo from what looked like a local newspaper's Facebook page. It was a memorial post from 8 years ago, and there he was, the same man I'd seen in my room. Same plaid shirt, same white hair combed back, same weathered face with those deep eye wrinkles. The caption read, "Local rancher Walter Brennan, 73, passes away at Restway Inn." Donna explained that Walter had been driving back from visiting his daughter in Denver when he felt chest pains and pulled into the motel. He'd checked into room 12, told the desk clerk he just needed to rest for a bit, and was found the next morning by housekeeping, sitting upright at the foot of the bed, having died sometime during the night from a massive heart attack. Natalie grabbed the phone from my hands to look closer at the photo, her skepticism evaporating as she compared it to my description. The article had more details. Walter had been a widower for 2 years at that point, still wearing his wedding ring, unable to let go of Eleanor even in death. The scar on his hand, Donna told us, was from a farming accident in his youth, caught his hand in some machinery and was lucky to keep his thumb. She said people occasionally mentioned strange experiences in room 12, but the motel owner, that elderly woman we'd met, refused to acknowledge anything unusual. Bad for business, Donna supposed. What disturbed me most wasn't that I'd possibly seen someone who died. It was how peaceful he'd seemed, just sitting there watching me sleep like he was watching over someone. Donna refilled our coffee with shaking hands and said Walter had been a kind man, the type who'd help anyone with anything, always checking on neighbors, always making sure everyone was okay. We left the diner in silence, both of us processing what we'd learned. Natalie drove while I searched online for anything about Walter Brennan and the Restway Inn. I found his obituary in the local paper's archives. Everything Donna had said checked out. Father of 3, grandfather of 7, veteran, ran a small cattle ranch for 40 years. The comments section under his obituary was filled with stories of his kindness, driving people to doctor's appointments, fixing fences for elderly neighbors without being asked, sitting with sick folks at the hospital. One comment from someone named Carl mentioned that Walter had lost his youngest daughter to cancer and never quite recovered from it. Said he became even more protective of people after that. The parallel to our own loss wasn't lost on me. Maybe that's why he'd appeared to me specifically. 2 people dealing with grief, meeting in the strangest way possible. Or maybe it was just my tired mind creating patterns where none existed, filling in gaps with a story I'd heard somewhere and forgotten. We never talked about going back to verify anything or investigate further. Some experiences don't need explanation. They just need to be acknowledged and left alone. Natalie and I continued our road trip, staying in better-lit chain hotels for the rest of the journey. But I still think about Walter Brennan sometimes, sitting at the foot of my bed in that run-down motel room, keeping watch in the darkness. I don't know if what I saw was real in any conventional sense. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was grief playing tricks on my mind. Maybe the power of suggestion from staying in a room where someone died. But I know what I experienced, and I know the strange comfort I felt afterward once the fear subsided. Like someone was telling me it was okay to rest, okay to grieve, okay to keep going. The Restway Inn is still in business according to Google, still charging $49 a night, room 12 still available for booking. Sometimes I wonder who else has met Walter and whether he's still there, watching over weary travelers, especially the ones carrying grief-like luggage they can't quite set down. The rain was coming down so hard that night in early November that I could barely see the road ahead, even with my wipers going full speed. My buddy Jason and I were driving through some forgotten stretch of highway in rural Nebraska, coming back from his cousin's wedding in Iowa. We'd planned to push through the whole drive in one shot, but the weather had other ideas. Around midnight, we finally admitted defeat when we saw the neon sign for the Clearwater Lodge flickering through the downpour. It was one of those old-fashioned motels where you park right in front of your room door, the kind with wood paneling that probably hadn't been updated since the 70s. The woman at the front desk had thick glasses and hair dyed an unnatural shade of burgundy, and she barely looked up from her crossword puzzle when she handed us the key to room 7. The room smelled like old carpet and that pine-scented cleaner they used to cover up cigarette smoke, even though there was a faded no smoking sign on the door. 2 twin beds with matching green bedspreads, a small TV bolted to the dresser, and between the beds this ancient-looking armchair covered in some kind of brown velour fabric that had seen better days. Jason crashed almost immediately after we got in, not even bothering to change out of his clothes. I stayed up for maybe another hour, scrolling through my phone and listening to the rain hammering against the window. The storm was getting worse, and every few minutes lightning would light up the whole room through the thin curtains. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off to the sound of Jason's snoring mixing with the storm outside. I don't know what woke me up. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 3:17 a.m. in those harsh red numbers. The storm had calmed down to a steady drizzle, and Jason had stopped snoring. My eyes were still adjusting to the darkness when I noticed it. Someone was sitting in that brown velour chair between our beds, not slouching or relaxed like someone who just sat down, but sitting perfectly straight, hands folded in their lap, facing forward toward the TV. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe Jason had gotten up to sit there? But no, I could see Jason's shape in the other bed, the blanket rising and falling with his breathing. This person, this figure, was wearing what looked like a light-colored button-up shirt, maybe pale blue or gray, hard to tell in the dark. Their hair was short, neatly combed to the side, and they weren't moving at all, not even the small movements people make when they breathe. I laid there completely still, trying to control my own breathing, watching this person through barely open eyes. They never turned their head, never shifted their weight, just sat there like they were waiting for something. The weird thing was how normal they looked, not threatening or scary in appearance, just a regular person, maybe in their 40s, average build, the kind of person you'd pass in a grocery store and never think twice about. But the way they sat there, so still, so silent, in our locked motel room at 3 in the morning, that's what made every muscle in my body tense up. I wanted to say something, to yell, to wake Jason, but I couldn't make myself move or speak. I just kept watching and they just kept sitting, and the minutes crawled by like hours. Then something changed. The person's head started to turn, slow and deliberate, like they were on a swivel. Not toward me, but toward Jason's bed. They stared at him for what must have been a full minute, then their head turned back to face forward. A few seconds later, they did it again, this time looking at me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to keep my breathing steady and deep like I was still asleep. I could feel them watching me, could sense their gaze even through my closed eyelids. When I finally risked opening my eyes just a crack, they were facing forward again. The person's hands were still folded in their lap, but now I noticed their fingers were moving slightly, tapping against each other in some kind of rhythm or pattern I couldn't make out. The movement was so subtle I hadn't noticed it before, but once I saw it, I couldn't stop watching those fingers drumming silently against each other. That's when Jason stirred in his sleep, mumbling something I couldn't understand and rolling over to face the wall. The person in the chair immediately stopped the finger movements and turned their head toward Jason again, watching him intently. After Jason settled back into sleep, the figure stood up. The movement was smooth, almost mechanical, like they were being pulled up by invisible strings. They were taller than I'd expected, maybe 6 feet or so, and their clothes were wrinkled like they'd been worn for days. They took 3 steps toward Jason's bed and just stood there looking down at him. From my angle, I could see their profile now. A straight nose, thin lips, clean-shaven face. Nothing remarkable except for how absolutely still they stood, like a department store mannequin. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it, but they never looked my way. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, the person walked around Jason's bed to the window. They pulled the curtain aside just slightly with 2 fingers and peered out into the parking lot. The dim light from outside caught their face for the first time, and I could see they had pale skin, almost grayish in that weak motel sign glow. They let the curtain fall back and moved to the dresser where the TV sat. Their fingers traced along the edge of the dresser, then stopped at Jason's wallet that he'd tossed there earlier. They didn't pick it up, didn't open it, just placed their palm flat on top of it for several seconds. Then they moved to my side of the room, and I had to force myself not to react as they got closer. They stopped at the small table next to my bed where I'd left my car keys and phone. Again, that same strange behavior, just touching them lightly, like they were memorizing the texture or temperature. The person then did something that still makes no sense to me. They went back to the chair and sat down exactly as before. Same posture, same position, hands folded the same way. But this time they started speaking, so quietly I could barely make out the words. It wasn't to us, or at least it didn't seem like it. They were reciting something, numbers maybe, or addresses, I couldn't quite tell. The voice was monotone, neither male nor female really, just this flat, continuous murmur. 417 Elm, 2311, North Side, blue trim, 7 minutes past. Random fragments that meant nothing to me, but they kept repeating certain phrases. Jason suddenly coughed in his sleep and the talking stopped instantly. The figure's head snapped toward him so fast it made me flinch. They watched Jason for another long moment, then slowly turned back to face forward. But the talking didn't resume. I must have been watching this person for another 20 minutes, fighting to stay awake despite the adrenaline, when suddenly Jason sat bolt upright in his bed. "What the hell?" he said, loud enough to make me jump. He was staring directly at the chair, at the person sitting there. "Who is that? Did you let someone in?" His voice was confused but alert, not the grogginess you'd expect from someone just waking up. The person in the chair didn't react to Jason's outburst at all, didn't even turn their head. They just sat there still as a statue. Jason reached over and flicked on the lamp on his nightstand, and in that harsh yellow light, we both got our first clear look at the intruder. It was a man, definitely, probably mid-40s like I'd guessed, wearing a pale blue dress shirt and dark slacks. His shoes were covered in mud, leaving small clumps on the carpet beneath the chair. His face was completely expressionless, eyes focused on nothing like he was in some kind of trance. "Hey," Jason said, louder this time, getting out of bed. "I'm talking to you." He took a step toward the chair, and that's when I finally found my voice. "Don't," I said, and Jason turned to look at me, surprised I was awake. "How long has he been there?" Jason asked, not taking his eyes off the man now. "Since 3:17, I whispered. "Maybe longer." Jason grabbed his phone, the screen lighting up his face. "I'm calling the front desk." But as he started dialing, the man stood up again with that same smooth, unnatural movement. We both tensed, ready for something to happen, but he just walked to the door, our locked door, and stood facing it, his hand resting on the doorknob. He didn't try to turn it, didn't pull on it, just stood there with his hand wrapped around the knob, his back to us. Jason held the phone to his ear, but after a few rings he lowered it. "No one's answering," he said, his voice tight with frustration. We both stood there, not sure what to do. The man at the door hadn't moved an inch. Finally, Jason said, "We need to get out of here," and started gathering his things. That's when the man spoke, clear as day, still facing the door. "Room 7, 2 guests, silver sedan, Illinois plates." He was describing us, our room, my car. Then he continued, "Check-in 11:43 p.m., front desk, burgundy hair, crossword puzzle, room 7. The way he said it was like he was recording information, filing it away somewhere. Jason and I looked at each other, and I could see my own fear reflected in his eyes. The man's hand finally released the doorknob, and he turned around to face us. His eyes were the strangest part. They were looking at us but not seeing us, if that makes any sense. Like he was looking through us at something else entirely. Without warning, the man walked past us, close enough that I could smell him. A mix of damp earth and something chemical, like fertilizer or cleaning products. He sat back down in the chair and closed his eyes. Jason and I didn't need to discuss it. We grabbed our bags, still packed from the night before, and headed for the door. Jason unlocked it and yanked it open, and we practically ran to my car. As I started the engine, we both looked back at the room. Through the window, we could see the man still sitting in the chair, silhouetted by the lamplight. We drove straight through until dawn, stopping only once for gas 2 hours away. At the gas station, Jason finally said what we were both thinking. That guy had a key, didn't he? How else could he have gotten in? And he was right. Our door had been locked, the chain still on when we'd left. There was no way he could have entered without a key. The next day, back home in Chicago, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Jason came over to my apartment, and we spent hours going over every detail. That's when he pulled out his phone and showed me something that made everything worse. While I'd been packing in a panic, he'd managed to take a photo of the man sitting in the chair. The image was blurry but clear enough to see his face. We decided to do some investigating, starting with calling the Clearwater Lodge. When we asked about our stay in room 7, the woman who answered, different from the night clerk, went quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that chilled me. "We don't rent out room 7 anymore. Haven't for 3 months. When we insisted we'd stayed there just 2 nights ago, she got flustered and said she'd have to check with the manager. She never called us back. We tried calling again several times over the next week, but they either hung up or said the manager wasn't available." About a month later, Jason found a news article online from a Nebraska newspaper. 3 months before our stay, a man named Douglas Garrett had been found dead in room 7 of the Clearwater Lodge. He'd been a private investigator from Omaha, working a case involving interstate theft rings that targeted travelers. The article included a photo, and even though it was grainy, we both recognized him immediately. It was the same man from Jason's phone photo. The article said he'd been found sitting in a chair, dead from carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heater. The really disturbing part? The police found notebooks full of detailed observations about motel guests, their cars, their routines. He'd been surveilling criminals but also recording information about regular travelers. They never figured out who he was working for or why he was specifically watching that motel. We never went back to verify anything, never called the police. What would we even say? But sometimes I wonder if Douglas Garrett is still sitting in that chair in room 7, still collecting information, still watching, and I wonder who's reading his reports. The fight started somewhere around mile marker 237 on Interstate 80, right after we passed that abandoned gas station, with the faded Sunoco sign hanging by one chain. My girlfriend Ashley and I had been driving for 14 hours straight from California to visit her parents in Ohio, and exhaustion was making us both say things we didn't mean. She wanted to push through the night and get there by morning, but I could barely keep my eyes open anymore. The windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle against the February sleet. and when I saw the neon vacancy sign for the Starlight Motor Lodge flickering through the storm, I pulled off without asking. Ashley slammed the car door hard enough to make the whole Corolla shake, and we checked in separately at the front desk, barely looking at each other. The old woman behind the counter, wearing a sweater with embroidered cats despite it being past midnight, handed us a single key attached to a plastic diamond with Room 8 etched into it. Our room smelled like old cigarettes masked with pine air freshener, and the carpet had these weird brown stains near the bathroom door that I tried not to think about. Ashley took the bed closest to the window without saying a word, and I collapsed on the other one, still wearing my jeans and sneakers. The mattress felt like it had been broken in by 1,000 different bodies over decades, sagging in the middle with springs that creaked every time I breathed. Around 2 a.m., just as I was finally drifting off, we heard it. A man's voice from the room next door, room 9, shouting something I couldn't quite make out through the wood paneling. Then came a woman's voice, high-pitched and desperate, followed by what sounded like furniture being shoved across the floor. Ashley sat up in her bed, and for the first time in hours, we actually looked at each other, both of us thinking the same thing. Should we call someone? The arguing got worse over the next hour, and I mean really bad. The man's voice turned guttural, like he was choking on his own rage, and we could hear thuds against our shared wall that made the generic landscape painting above my bed rattle in its frame. The woman was sobbing now, these long, drawn-out wails that seemed to go on forever before cutting off abruptly. Then there'd be silence for maybe 30 seconds, just long enough for us to think it was over, before it would start up again. Him screaming about money, about lies, about someone named Bridget who apparently ruined everything. Ashley grabbed her phone and started recording the sounds, whispering to me that we might need evidence if something really bad happened. At one point, we heard what sounded exactly like a body hitting the floor, followed by dragging sounds across their carpet. I pressed my ear against the wall and could make out the woman pleading, saying please over and over, her voice muffled like something was covering her mouth. I finally had enough when we heard glass breaking. Not just a cup or something small, but what sounded like the mirror or maybe the window. I threw on my jacket and told Ashley I was going to the front desk to report it, but she grabbed my arm and said we should call 911 instead. While we were arguing about it in whispers, afraid they might hear us and turn their anger our way, the sounds suddenly stopped completely. Not gradually, not like they were calming down, but all at once like someone had hit a mute button. We sat there in the sudden silence for maybe 5 minutes, both of us breathing shallow, waiting for something else to happen. Ashley pointed at the digital clock on the nightstand, 3:47 a.m., and mouthed that maybe they had finally worn themselves out. But then, just as I was convincing myself to try to sleep again, we heard 3 slow, deliberate knocks on our door. Not pounding or frantic, but measured, like someone counting between each one. Neither of us moved. Ashley had her phone ready to dial 911, her thumb hovering over the call button, and I was gripping the lamp from the nightstand like a baseball bat. The knocks came again, same rhythm, same force, and this time followed by a woman's voice, but not the crying woman from next door. This voice was calm, almost cheerful, asking if everything was all right in there, if we needed anything. It sounded like the old lady from the front desk, but wrong somehow, like she was standing too close to the door or speaking through water. Ashley whispered that the desk clerk wouldn't make rounds at 4 a.m. and I had to agree. We stayed frozen like that for probably 10 minutes, barely breathing, until we heard footsteps moving away down the concrete walkway. They had this weird shuffling quality, and I counted at least 14 steps before they faded out completely, which seemed like too many to just reach the next room. The rest of the night was pure hell, even though room 9 stayed quiet. Every little sound made us jump. The ice machine down the hall cycling on, a truck passing on the interstate, the heater kicking in with a metallic groan. Around 5:30 a.m., we heard movement from room 9 again, but different this time. Drawers opening and closing, the bathroom faucet running, the squeak of bed springs like someone sitting down and standing up repeatedly. Normal morning sounds, except there was something mechanical about the pattern, the same sequence repeating every few minutes like a loop. Ashley had been recording everything on her phone, and when she played back one section, we realized the sounds were identical each time. Not just similar, but exactly the same down to a little cough at the end. By the time pale sunlight started leaking through the blinds, we had packed our stuff and were ready to get the hell out of there. At 7 a.m. sharp, we walked to the front office together, dragging our bags and probably looking like we'd been up all night, which we had. A different woman was behind the desk now, younger, maybe 40, wearing a name tag that said Janet in faded letters. I set the room key on the counter and tried to keep my voice steady as I told her about the violent fight in room 9, how we'd been worried someone might be hurt. Janet's face scrunched up in confusion, and she turned to check the guest registry, running her finger down a handwritten list in a spiral notebook. She looked up at us with this expression of genuine bewilderment and said room 9 had been vacant for 3 days. Ashley immediately pulled out her phone to show the recordings, but Janet held up her hand and said she believed we heard something, but it couldn't have been from that room. She even offered to show us, walking us back down the row of rooms with a massive ring of keys jangling from her belt. When Janet unlocked room 9, the smell hit us first, mothballs and something else, like wet newspaper left to rot. The room was clearly unused, with the beds made so tight you could bounce a quarter off them. No luggage, no personal items, nothing. But what made my chest tighten was the bathroom mirror, completely shattered in a spiderweb pattern with several pieces missing, and beneath it on the counter, dried blood in a pattern that looked like someone had gripped the edge of the sink with bloody hands. Janet gasped and immediately started apologizing, saying maintenance should have caught this, that sometimes drifters break in through the bathroom windows. But Ashley was pointing at something else. The carpet near the wall we shared had these deep indentations, 4 of them in a row, like furniture legs had been pressing down for years. Except the room only had 2 beds, both against the opposite wall and no other furniture that would make those marks. Janet started making phone calls right there in the room, first to someone she called Roy, apparently the maintenance guy, then to someone else who seemed to be the owner. While she was distracted, I walked over to the wall we'd heard everything through and put my hand flat against it. The paneling was cold, way colder than it should have been with the heater running all night, and when I knocked on it, the sound was all wrong. Not hollow like you'd expect from thin motel walls, but solid, like there was something dense packed behind it. Ashley was examining the broken mirror more closely and noticed something I'd missed. Some of the missing pieces were on the floor, but others seemed to have been pushed through to whatever was behind the mirror, leaving these small holes you could almost see through into darkness. She tried shining her phone flashlight through one of them, but the light just seemed to get swallowed up. That's when Janet got off the phone and told us something that made everything worse. She said Roy remembered this room now. There had been an incident in early January, about 6 weeks ago. A couple had stayed here and gotten into a domestic dispute. The man, whose name she didn't know, had been arrested after the woman called 911, but she'd refused to press charges and they'd both checked out the next morning. The thing was, the room had been cleaned and inspected since then, multiple times, and the mirror had definitely been replaced. She showed us a maintenance log to prove it, with Roy's signature dated just 5 days ago, confirming the room was in perfect condition. But here's what really got to me. When Ashley asked to see the guest registry again, to look at January's entries, Janet flipped back through the notebook and found that several pages had been torn out. Roughly the first 2 weeks of January were just gone, leaving only these little paper fragments stuck in the spiral binding. We left without even asking for a refund, just got in the car and drove in silence for about 20 miles, before Ashley finally played back the recordings from her phone. The arguing voices were there, clear as day, but when she got to the part where we'd heard the morning sounds, that repetitive loop of drawers and faucets, there was just static. Not regular static either, but this rhythmic pulsing sound like a heartbeat through an ultrasound machine. We pulled over at a rest stop, and I called the motel from a payphone, pretending to be a customer asking about room 9's availability. The young guy who answered said that room didn't exist, that their rooms only went up to 8. and when I insisted I'd stayed next to room 9 just that morning, he got quiet for a long moment before saying I must be confused, maybe thinking of a different motel. Ashley grabbed the phone from me and demanded to speak to Janet, but the guy said nobody named Janet worked there, never had. We drove the rest of the way to her parents' house without talking about it, but that night Ashley couldn't sleep and started researching the motel online. She found 3 different reviews from the past 2 years, mentioning sounds from room 9, always the same story: violent arguments, crying, furniture moving, and always with the same response from management that room 9 didn't exist. One review included a photo of the motel from the parking lot, and when we zoomed in, we could count the doors, 8 rooms, just like the kid on the phone had said. But in our photo, the one Ashley had taken that morning to show her parents what a dump we'd stayed in, there were clearly 9 doors. We still have that photo, and we still have the recordings. And sometimes I wake up at 3:47 a.m. for no reason at all, my heart pounding, absolutely certain I can hear that measured knocking again, even though we live in a house now with no shared walls, no room 9, no explanation that makes any kind of sense. Last summer changed everything about how I travel. I was 32, working as a medical equipment sales rep, which meant spending at least 3 nights a week in different motels across the Midwest. The job paid well, and honestly, I'd gotten used to the routine. Check in, grab dinner at whatever chain restaurant was nearby, catch up on emails, sleep, and drive to the next appointment. That Wednesday in late July started exactly like hundreds of other nights on the road, except this time I'd stopped at a place called the Riverside Lodge, about 40 miles outside of Milwaukee. The neon sign out front had 2 letters burned out, and the parking lot had more potholes than asphalt. But after 8 hours of driving through construction zones, I just wanted a shower and a bed. The guy at the front desk barely looked up when I walked in. His name tag said Kevin, and he had this weird habit of scratching at a patch of psoriasis on his elbow, while he typed with one hand. The lobby smelled like old carpet and whatever pine-scented cleaner they'd used to try to mask it. He handed me the key to room 14, an actual metal key, not a card, and mumbled something about the ice machine being broken. The room was at the far end of the building, past a flickering hallway light that made everything look like those old horror movies my brother used to make me watch. When I opened the door, that familiar musty motel smell hit me, mixed with something else I couldn't place, like burnt plastic or melted rubber. The AC unit under the window was already running full blast, making this grinding noise every few seconds, but at least it was cold. I dropped my suitcase on the luggage rack and did my usual room check, pulled back the comforter to check for bed bugs, tested the locks on the windows, made sure the bathroom door actually closed all the way. Everything seemed normal enough for a cheap motel. The TV remote was wrapped in plastic. The coffee maker had a layer of dust on it, and there was a cigarette burn on the nightstand, even though this was supposedly a non-smoking room. While I was setting up my laptop on the little desk, I noticed this tiny red light up in the corner, where the wall met the ceiling. Just a small dot, barely visible unless you were looking right at it. I figured it was a smoke detector, or maybe some kind of security sensor. Most of these older places had been retrofitting their rooms with new safety equipment to meet insurance requirements. I actually remember thinking it was good they were finally updating their systems, especially in a place that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 80s. Around 9:30, after I'd showered and changed into my pajamas, I called my sister Beth to check in. She was going through a rough divorce and liked hearing about my adventures on the road. It distracted her from her own problems. While we were talking, I walked around the room, stretching my legs after the long drive. That's when I noticed the red light again, except this time something bothered me about it. The angle was wrong for a smoke detector. Those are usually mounted flat against the ceiling, but this thing seemed to be pointing down into the room. I stood on the bed to get a closer look, and that's when I saw it wasn't mounted on any kind of standard bracket. It was just this small black cube, maybe the size of a dice, stuck to the wall with what looked like putty or mounting tape. My chest got tight and I told Beth I'd call her back. The next few minutes were a blur of panic and disbelief. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it directly at the device. Through the phone's light, I could see a tiny lens in the center of that red dot. My whole body went numb. I'd been in this room for over 2 hours. I'd changed clothes, walked around in just a towel after my shower, had been sitting on the bed in my underwear while working on my laptop. I climbed down and immediately started searching the rest of the room, running my fingers along every surface, checking behind every picture frame, examining the air vents. There was another one behind the mirror in the bathroom, tucked into the frame where the glass met the wood. This one didn't have a light, just a tiny hole that you'd never notice unless you were specifically looking for it. The mirror was positioned perfectly to see into the shower. I threw on my jeans and t-shirt, not even caring that my hair was still wet, and ran down to the front desk. Kevin was still there, now watching something on his phone with the volume turned up too loud. Sounded like some kind of gaming stream. When I slammed my hands on the counter and told him about the cameras, his whole demeanor changed. He stopped scratching his elbow and looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. Not surprise, not concern, just mild annoyance, like I'd interrupted something important. He said the owners had installed security cameras in some rooms after a bunch of break-ins last year, claimed it was all legal, and there should have been a notice in the rental agreement. When I demanded to see this supposed agreement, he pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from under the desk and pointed to a line in tiny print at the bottom about security monitoring for guest safety. His finger left a greasy mark on the paper. I snatched the paper and read it 3 times, but the wording was so vague it could mean anything. When I asked him who had access to the footage, he shrugged and said it went to a security company the owners contracted with, someplace called Secure View Solutions. He claimed he didn't know anything else about it, but the way he kept glancing at his phone made my skin prickle. I demanded a different room, one without cameras, and he actually laughed. This short, wet sound like he was clearing his throat. He said all the rooms had them now, for insurance purposes, but if I wanted to leave, he could process a refund minus the cleaning fee. A cleaning fee for a room I'd been in for 2 hours. While we were arguing, another guest came in, a middle-aged guy in a wrinkled suit who walked straight past us to his room without making eye contact. Kevin watched him go, then turned back to me with this blank expression and asked if I wanted the refund or not. I went back to room 14 to pack my things, moving as fast as I could, while keeping my body turned away from the corners where I knew the cameras were. The whole time I was throwing stuff into my suitcase, I kept thinking about who might be watching. Were they watching right now? Had they been watching when I called my sister and mentioned her divorce, her kids' names, where she lived? My hands wouldn't stop trembling as I zipped up my bag. Before I left, I took photos of both cameras with my phone, making sure to capture their exact positions and the sketchy wiring running from them into the walls. As I was leaving, I noticed something I'd missed before. There were tiny holes drilled in the walls near the electrical outlets, and thin black cables running along the baseboards, painted over but still visible if you knew what to look for. This wasn't some recent security upgrade. This had been planned, built into the bones of the room. I drove to a well-lit truck stop about 15 miles away and sat in my car for an hour, trying to figure out what to do. My first call was to the police. The dispatcher connected me to an officer who took my report over the phone, but he sounded exhausted and kept asking me to repeat details like he wasn't really writing them down. He said they'd send someone to investigate in the morning, but without proof that the cameras were recording without consent or being used for illegal purposes, there wasn't much they could do immediately. Hidden cameras in private property were a gray area, he said, especially if there was any kind of written notice, no matter how vague. After I hung up, I sat there in the harsh fluorescent light of the truck stop, watching families and truckers come and go, feeling like everyone could somehow see through my clothes, like the violation had followed me out of that room. The worst part came 3 days later. I'd filed reports with the police, the Better Business Bureau, even tried to leave reviews online, but most platforms removed them for lacking verification. Then I got a text from an unknown number. No words, just a link. Against every instinct, I clicked it. The page that loaded made me vomit right there in my kitchen. It was a streaming site, and there I was, a thumbnail image of me in that motel room standing in my underwear, looking at my laptop. The video title had my first name and the city I lived in. The view count was over 3,000. I called the police again, and this time they took it seriously. But the site was hosted overseas, the IP addresses were masked, and the trail went cold fast. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Gomez who'd seen too much of this stuff, told me these operations pop up and disappear constantly, selling footage to subscription sites that redistribute it across the dark web. I spent the next 2 months in a paranoid haze. I hired a lawyer who sent cease and desist letters that went nowhere. I paid a company $800 to scrub my information from the internet, but new videos kept appearing with different watermarks, different titles, always with just enough personal information to make me searchable. My sales numbers dropped because I couldn't bring myself to stay in motels anymore. I'd drive 4 hours back home instead of staying overnight, or sleep in my car at rest stops. Every red light made me nauseous. Every small black object in every room became suspicious. I bought a device online that detects camera lenses, this little gadget that reflects light to spot hidden equipment, and I'd spend 30 minutes sweeping every room I entered. Bathrooms at restaurants, changing rooms at stores, even my own apartment, because I couldn't shake the feeling that if it happened once, it could happen again. My therapist said I was developing symptoms of PTSD, but knowing that didn't make the hypervigilance go away. The Riverside Lodge is still operating. I check sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, reading their new reviews on travel sites. Most are one-star complaints about dirty rooms and rude staff, but every few weeks there's one that makes me sick, usually from women, mentioning weird feelings about the place, strange sounds at night, or how the owners seem to be watching them too closely. I report every review I find to the platforms, to the police, to anyone who will listen. But Kevin isn't there anymore. The ownership supposedly changed hands, and there's no proof the new owners have any connection to what happened. Detective Gomez called me last month to say they'd found similar operations in 12 other motels across 3 states, all with different owners on paper but the same setup. Old buildings, cheap rates, rooms at the end of hallways, and those tiny black cubes tucked into corners. They shut down 5 of them, but the rest disappeared before warrants could be served, probably just to resurface somewhere else with different names, different facades, same hidden cameras broadcasting to anonymous servers halfway around the world. The divorce papers were finally signed in March 2018, and I needed to get from Oregon to Florida where my sister lived. I'd sold everything that wouldn't fit in my beat-up Ford Explorer, packed what was left of my life into boxes, and hit the road with nothing but podcasts and gas station coffee to keep me company. After 16 hours of driving through endless stretches of highway, my eyes were burning and my back was screaming. It was around 9 p.m. when I saw the flickering neon sign for the Desert Palm Lodge, just off Interstate 40 in Arizona. The place looked exactly like what you'd expect for $49 a night. Peeling paint, a half-dead palm tree by the office, and one of those old-school signs where half the letters didn't light up anymore. But at that point, I would have slept in my car if I had to, so I pulled into the gravel parking lot and headed to the office. The manager was this tall, skinny guy named Frank, who had these really pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink enough. He typed my information into an ancient computer that made clicking sounds like it was about to die, then reached behind him and grabbed a key attached to one of those big plastic diamond-shaped tags. "Room 23, he said, sliding it across the counter. But then he stopped, his hand still on the key, and stared at me for what felt like forever. His fingers started tapping on the counter, not in a nervous way, but deliberate, like he was counting something in his head. Then suddenly he yanked the key back and turned around to the wall of keys behind him. "Actually, no. Let me give you room 31 instead. Better water pressure." He grabbed a different key and practically shoved it at me, already turning back to his computer before I could even respond. The way he said it wasn't like a suggestion. It was like he was telling me I had no choice in the matter. Room 31 was at the far end of the building, past the ice machine that hummed like it was fighting for its life, and a vending machine full of snacks that probably expired years ago. When I walked past room 23 on my way there, I noticed something weird. The door was slightly newer than all the others, like it had been replaced recently. The paint was a different shade of beige, just different enough that you'd notice if you were paying attention. There was also this chemical smell coming from that direction, like industrial bleach mixed with something else I couldn't place. Room 31 itself was standard motel shabby. Cigarette burns on the nightstand even though it was supposedly non-smoking, a TV from the 90s, and curtains that didn't quite close all the way. I threw my overnight bag on the bed and went to grab the rest of my stuff from the car. But when I walked past the office, Frank was standing outside smoking, watching me. Not trying to hide it either, just standing there under the yellow bug light, following my every move. I decided to grab dinner at the diner across the street, this 24-hour place called Rusty's that had seen better days, but at least had decent reviews online. The waitress, Gloria, had been working there for 23 years according to her name tag, and she had that friendly but tired look of someone who'd heard every story that passed through. When I mentioned I was staying at the Desert Palm, she gave me this look. Not quite pity, not quite concern, but something in between. "Frank put you in a good room?" she asked while pouring my coffee. I told her room 31, and she nodded slowly, refilling my cup even though I'd barely taken a sip. "That's good. You staying just the one night?" When I confirmed I was leaving first thing in the morning, she patted my hand and said, "Smart girl," before walking away to take another order. The way she said it made my chest feel tight, like there was something everyone knew except me. When I got back to the motel around 10:30, the parking lot was mostly empty except for my Explorer, an old Chevy pickup, and a white sedan with rental plates. Frank wasn't at the desk anymore. There was a younger guy there now, maybe early 20s, scrolling through his phone with earbuds in. I walked past room 23 again, and this time I noticed something else. The window had boards behind the curtains. You could only see them because the curtain had gotten caught on something and pulled aside just enough to show the edge of a 2x4. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, trying to understand why a motel room would be boarded up from the inside, but still have a normal-looking door. That chemical smell was stronger now too, and there was something else. This faint buzzing sound, like fluorescent lights that were about to burn out. I hurried to my room and double-locked the door, putting the chain on for good measure. I couldn't sleep. Every time a car passed on the highway, the headlights would sweep across my ceiling through the gap in the curtains, and I kept thinking about that boarded-up window. Around 2 a.m. I heard footsteps outside my door, slow, deliberate, like someone was trying not to make noise. They stopped right outside, and I could see the shadow of feet in the gap under the door. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever it was could hear it. Then I heard keys jingling, and the doorknob to my room started to turn. Thank God I'd used the chain because the door opened about 2 inches before catching. I heard Frank's voice whisper, "Just checking you're okay, miss." Sometimes the heating acts up. I yelled back that I was fine, and after what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, he closed the door and the footsteps moved away. But here's the thing. It was April in Arizona, and I hadn't even turned the heat on. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the chair facing the door with my car keys in one hand and my phone in the other, ready to call 911 if Frank tried to come back. As soon as the sun started coming up around 5:30, I threw everything in my bag and got the hell out of there. But when I passed the office to drop off the key, the young guy from last night was still there, and he looked exhausted. I asked him if Frank always checked on guests like that, trying to keep my voice casual. The kid's face went white, and he asked me what I meant. When I told him about Frank trying to open my door at 2 a.m., he pulled up something on the computer and turned the monitor toward me. "Ma'am, Frank left at 10 p.m., see? He clocked out right here." He showed me the timesheet, and there it was. Frank out at 10:03 p.m. and this kid, Jeremy, clocked in at 10:05 p.m. "And honestly," Jeremy added, looking nervous now, Frank never does night checks, that's strictly against policy. Jeremy kept staring at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. His hands were trembling as he typed something, and I saw him pull up the room assignments for the night. You said you're in room 31, right? I nodded and he spun the monitor around again. There on the screen, clear as day, it showed room 23, occupied, checked in at 9:17 p.m. Room 31, vacant. My name wasn't anywhere in the system. This doesn't make sense, Jeremy muttered, clicking through different screens. Room 23 has been showing occupied every night for the past 6 months, but we never... Frank told me never to assign that room, said it was being renovated. He looked up at me with these wide, scared eyes. Miss, according to our system, you checked into room 23 last night. But that's impossible because... He trailed off, and I could see him struggling with whether to tell me something. Because what? I practically shouted, and Jeremy flinched. He looked around the empty office like someone might be listening, then leaned forward and whispered, because a woman died in that room 6 months ago. The police, they never figured out what happened. She was just found there, and the room was... He swallowed hard. It was bad, really bad. They sealed it up after the investigation, but Frank never took it out of the system. Said corporate would handle it, but they never did. My whole body went cold as he continued. The woman who died, her name was Claire Phillips. She was traveling alone, heading to Florida to stay with her sister after a divorce. He turned his monitor back around and pulled up an old news article from his phone. The headline read, "Woman found dead in motel room, circumstances unclear." But what made me nearly pass out was the photo. Claire Phillips looked almost exactly like me. Same dark hair, same build, even the same kind of round face and green eyes. We could have been sisters. Jeremy was typing frantically now, pulling up reservation records from 6 months ago. Claire checked in on a Wednesday night in September. Frank was working that shift. His voice dropped even lower. She was supposed to be in room 31, but Frank moved her to room 23 at the last minute. Just like... He stared at me, and we both understood what he wasn't saying, just like Frank had tried to do with me. There were 3 other women before Claire, Jeremy continued, his fingers flying across the keyboard. All traveling alone, all similar looking. All mysteriously moved to room 23 by Frank. 2 of them left in the middle of the night and never filed complaints. 1 went missing completely. Her car was found abandoned 2 states over. He grabbed a piece of paper and started writing something down. You need to go to the police now. Take this, it's everything I can print from our records. I'll say the printer was broken if anyone asks. I grabbed the papers and ran to my car, but as I was pulling out, I saw Frank's beat-up Toyota Corolla pulling into the parking lot. He wasn't supposed to be there for hours, but there he was, and when he saw me, his face changed into something I'll never forget. Pure rage mixed with something else, maybe disappointment. Like I was a fish that had gotten off the hook. I floored it out of there and drove straight to the police station in the next town over. The detective I spoke to, a woman named Hawkins, went pale when I showed her the papers and told her everything. Turns out they'd been investigating Frank for months but could never get enough evidence. The Room 23 system glitch was the key they needed. It proved he'd been manipulating records to cover his tracks. They arrested him that afternoon, and when they searched his house, they found journals. Detailed journals about each woman who'd stayed in Room 23, including plans for what he intended to do. He'd been using his key to enter the rooms at night, and Claire Phillips had fought back. That's how she died, fighting him off. The police unsealed Room 23 as part of the investigation, and what they found confirmed everything. Hidden cameras in the vents, holes drilled in the walls, and DNA evidence from multiple women. Frank had turned that room into his own sick hunting ground, specifically targeting women who looked like his ex-wife who'd left him years ago. The district attorney told me I was lucky. Frank had marked me as perfect in his journal entry from that night, and if he'd succeeded in moving me to Room 23, I would have become another statistic. The motel was shut down permanently, and Frank got life without parole after they connected him to 2 other missing women from different states. Jeremy testified against him and told the court how Frank had threatened him to keep quiet about the room. I still drive cross-country sometimes for my job now, but I never stay in motels anymore. I'll drive through the night or sleep in my car before I ever take that risk again. And sometimes, when I'm on those long, empty highways, I think about Claire Phillips and how she saved my life by fighting back, by making Frank nervous enough to make mistakes, by ensuring he'd never have another perfect victim in room 23. I was heading east through Montana last August, driving my old Nissan Pathfinder on a work assignment that had me inspecting cell towers across 3 states. The company I worked for back then specialized in infrastructure maintenance, and they'd send me out on these long solo trips every few months to check equipment and file reports. I'd been on the road for about 4 days already, sleeping in different motels each night, eating at truck stops and diners, basically living out of my duffel bag and the cooler I kept in the back seat. That particular Thursday, I'd driven almost 11 hours straight, only stopping for gas and a quick sandwich at some forgettable rest area. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of the Pine Ridge Motel around 9:30 at night, my eyes were burning and my shoulders ached from gripping the steering wheel. The place sat right off Highway 91, one of those single-story motor lodges with doors that opened directly to the parking lot, painted this faded yellow color that probably looked cheerful 20 years ago. The woman at the front desk had these thick glasses that magnified her eyes to an almost comical size, and she kept sniffling while she processed my credit card, mentioning something about allergies and how the wildfire smoke made everything worse this time of year. She handed me the key to room 14, told me the ice machine was broken but there was a gas station across the street if I needed anything, and then went back to watching some game show on a tiny television behind the counter. My room was exactly what you'd expect for $65 a night. Brown carpet that felt slightly damp even though it hadn't rained, a bed with a floral comforter that smelled like industrial detergent, and a bathroom where the faucet dripped no matter how hard you turned the handle. But honestly, after that many hours on the road, I didn't care. I took a lukewarm shower, called my girlfriend Megan to let her know where I'd stopped for the night, and crashed hard, not even bothering to turn off the lamp beside the bed. The knocking woke me at exactly 3:07 a.m. I remember because the red numbers on the clock radio were the first thing I saw when my eyes snapped open. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just this steady, deliberate rhythm. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. The kind of sound that makes you question if you're actually hearing it, or if it's just pipes in the walls, or maybe the air conditioner kicking on. I lay there for probably 30 seconds, completely still, waiting to see if it would happen again. Then it did. 3 more knocks, soft but insistent, like someone trying to be polite while also making sure they were heard. I sat up slowly, my mouth dry from the recycled motel air, and noticed that the lamp I'd left on had been turned off at some point, leaving only a thin strip of parking lot light coming through the gap in the curtains. The knocking came again, and this time I was sure it was at my door. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, then crept toward the door in my boxers and the t-shirt I'd worn to bed. The carpet felt grittier under my bare feet than it had earlier in my socks, and I could hear my own breathing seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Through the peephole, I saw absolutely nothing, just the dimly lit walkway and the door to room 15 across from mine, maybe 8 feet away. The motion sensor light that should have been triggered by anyone standing at my door wasn't on. I waited, holding my breath, my eye pressed against that tiny lens until it started to hurt. Another set of knocks came, and I swear I could feel them vibrating through the door against my forehead, but there was nobody there. I even tried angling my view as far left and right as the peephole would allow, thinking maybe someone was standing flat against the wall beside my door, but I couldn't see anyone. My first instinct was to call out, ask who was there, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the weird timing. Maybe it was being alone in a sketchy motel in the middle of nowhere. but announcing that I was awake and aware suddenly seemed like the worst possible move. Instead, I backed away from the door and grabbed my car keys from the dresser, holding them between my fingers like I'd seen in some self-defense video years ago. The knocking stopped for maybe 2 minutes, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, or if it was just someone at the wrong room who'd finally realized their mistake. Then it started again, but different this time. Instead of the polite triple knock pattern, it was just one knock, then nothing for about 10 seconds, then another single knock. Like whoever was doing it was testing something, seeing if I'd respond. I picked up my phone and almost called 911, but what would I say? Someone's knocking on my door and I can't see them. They'd probably think I was drunk or high. I must have stood there in the middle of that musty room for at least 20 minutes, every muscle tense, listening to these sporadic knocks that came without any predictable rhythm. Sometimes it would be silent for a full minute. Then I'd hear a soft tap, tap, tap that was barely louder than my own heartbeat. Other times it was a single firm knock that made me jump even though I was expecting it. At some point, I noticed something that made my whole body go rigid. The doorknob was turning, not like someone trying to force it open, but slowly, carefully, just testing to see if it was locked. I'd engaged both the regular lock and the deadbolt when I came in, habit from years of traveling alone. But seeing that knob rotate maybe a quarter turn before stopping and returning to its original position made me realize whoever was out there wasn't just knocking randomly. They were checking every room, looking for one that someone forgot to secure. I decided to do something that, looking back, was probably stupid, but felt necessary at the time. I crept over to the window beside the door and carefully pulled the curtain back just an inch, trying to get a different angle on whoever was out there. The parking lot was mostly dark, except for one flickering streetlight near the motel's sign and the glow from a Pepsi vending machine 3 doors down. My Pathfinder was right where I'd left it, along with maybe 6 other vehicles scattered across the lot. A couple of semis at the far end, a minivan with Oklahoma plates, and a few pickups. Nothing looked out of place, no one walking around, no suspicious cars idling with their lights off. But then I saw it, a shadow moving along the walkway, staying close to the wall where the overhead lights didn't quite reach. It wasn't walking normally. It was more like sliding along, stopping at each door for maybe 30 seconds before moving to the next one. From my angle, I could only make out that it was definitely a person, average height, wearing something dark, but the way they moved was deliberate and practiced, like they'd done this exact thing many times before. The shadow reached room 16, 2 doors down from mine, and I watched it stop and lean close to the door. Even from inside my room, I could hear the faint sound of knocking, that same triple knock pattern that had woken me up. This went on for maybe a minute before the figure tried the doorknob, jiggling it more aggressively than they had with mine. Then they moved to room 17, and I realized they were working their way down the entire row of rooms. At that point, my phone showed 3:41 a.m., and I made the decision to call the front desk. It rang probably 15 times before that same woman with the thick glasses answered, sounding groggy and annoyed. I told her someone was going door to door, trying doorknobs, and she needed to call the police. She mumbled something about checking it out and hung up. I watched through the gap in my curtain for another 10 minutes, but the shadow had disappeared somewhere past room 18, and I couldn't see that far without opening my door, which was absolutely not happening. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor between the bed and the wall, my back against the nightstand, holding a pocket knife I'd dug out of my travel bag. Every little sound made me tense up. The ice machine suddenly dropping cubes somewhere down the walkway, a door slamming shut at the far end of the motel, even just the normal settling noises that old buildings make. Around 4:30, I heard what sounded like rapid footsteps passing my room, almost running, followed by a car door slamming and an engine starting up. I wanted to look out the window again, but couldn't bring myself to move from my spot on the floor. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me exhausted but still too wired to even think about sleeping. I kept checking my phone, watching the minutes crawl by, waiting for sunrise like it was some kind of magical protection. The woman from the front desk never came by to check anything, never called back, and I didn't see any police cars pull up. By 5:45, when the sky started getting that grayish pre-dawn color, I finally felt safe enough to stand up and stretch my cramped legs. At exactly 6 a.m., I was packed and ready to leave. I'd thrown everything into my bag without folding anything, just wanting to get out of that room as fast as possible. When I opened the door, the morning felt surreal. Birds chirping, a maintenance guy pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies down the walkway, everything normal and peaceful. I loaded my stuff into the Pathfinder and was about to drive off when I decided to stop by the office to check out properly and maybe say something about the night before. There was a different person at the desk now, a younger guy with a neck tattoo who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. While he was processing my receipt, I mentioned the knocking and the person trying doorknobs, and his expression changed immediately. He asked what time it happened, which room I was in, and then told me I was lucky I had both locks engaged. Apparently, around 4:15 that morning, the guest in room 22 had called the police because their door had been forced open while they were sleeping. Nothing was stolen, but the guest, an older man traveling to visit his daughter, woke up to find someone standing at the foot of his bed, just watching him. The guy at the desk pulled out an incident report form and started filling it out while telling me more details. The old man in room 22 had apparently screamed, which scared off the intruder, who ran out through the still open door and disappeared into the darkness. The police found marks on the door frame where it looked like someone had used a crowbar or something similar to pop the lock. The deadbolt hadn't been engaged, just the standard lock that comes with the doorknob. They also found similar marks on 3 other doors, rooms 19, 20, and 21, but those had deadbolts locked so the person couldn't get in. The desk clerk said the police were reviewing security footage, but the cameras only covered the parking lot and the office area, not the walkways in front of the rooms. He mentioned that this was the 3rd incident like this in the past 2 months, always happening between 3 and 4 a.m., always targeting solo travelers in the rooms furthest from the office. The way he said it so matter-of-factly, like it was just another minor inconvenience, made me realize they knew this was a problem and hadn't done anything to warn guests or improve security. I left that motel feeling a mix of relief and anger that's hard to describe. Relief that I'd trusted my instincts to lock both locks and stay alert instead of opening the door or going back to sleep. Anger that the motel staff knew someone was targeting their guests and didn't even have the decency to put up a sign reminding people to use their deadbolts or report suspicious activity. I ended up filing my own police report at a station about 20 miles down the highway, and the officer there told me they suspected it was someone who used to work at various motels along that stretch of road. Someone who knew exactly which rooms were occupied by checking the parking lot and the registration system. They never caught anyone as far as I know. I checked online a few times over the following months, but there were no arrests mentioned. I still travel for work sometimes, though I changed companies last year, and I never stay in ground floor motel rooms anymore. If that's the only option, I keep driving until I find somewhere else. And I always use every lock available. Plus, I bring my own door wedge alarm that I bought online for $12. Some people think I'm paranoid, but they didn't spend a night listening to someone methodically testing doors, looking for that one person who forgot to turn that second lock. I was on a short work trip, staying overnight at a small roadside motel. At that point in my life, I was constantly driving from one town to another, meeting clients during the day and crashing wherever I could find a vacancy. That night, I had checked in late, grabbed a quick shower, and went down the hall to find something from the vending machine. It was quiet in that place, the kind of silence where you can hear the hum of the old fluorescent light above the ice machine. That's where I met him. He was standing there feeding coins into the soda machine, tall with dark hair that was slightly messy like he had been driving all day. He introduced himself as Mark. His voice was steady but had a scratch to it, like someone who had smoked for years. We made small talk, mostly about long drives and bad motel coffee, the usual things strangers mention when crossing paths. He told me he was staying in room 23, just down the hall from mine, and that he was heading further east in the morning. I remember thinking it was nice to actually talk to someone after a day alone on the road. The conversation lasted maybe 15 minutes, just two tired travelers talking beside humming machines in a dim hallway. What struck me was how specific he was, mentioning his drive through small back roads, complaining about a diner where the pancakes tasted like cardboard. He laughed about it, and for some reason it felt genuine enough that I went back to my room thinking maybe I'd bump into him again in the morning before checkout. I remember lying in bed afterward, feeling strangely less alone, knowing another guest was just a few doors away. The next morning, after packing up, I went to the front desk to drop off my key. On a whim, I asked the clerk if Mark had already checked out. She gave me a confused look and asked for his last name. When I told her, she frowned and flipped through the guest list behind the counter. After a minute, she said there was no record of anyone by that name ever checking in. I thought maybe he'd used a different name, but then she told me something that still unsettles me. There was no room 23 in that building. I laughed at first, thinking maybe she misunderstood me. I even described him. The messy dark hair, the raspy voice, his story about the cardboard pancakes. The clerk just shook her head and said she'd worked the front desk all evening and hadn't seen anyone like that walk in. I pressed a little harder, mentioning the soda machine conversation, the fact that he'd told me he was in room 23. That's when she pulled out a laminated map of the property and laid it on the counter. She pointed at the layout. The room numbers stopped at 21 on that side of the building, and the next wing began with 30. There had never been a room 23. I left the office unsettled but still trying to rationalize it. Maybe he'd lied about the number for privacy. Maybe he was staying off the books for some reason. It wasn't until I walked back down the hall to grab a bottle of water from the vending machine that the strangeness hit me full force. The machine where we'd stood talking was half empty, the hum softer that morning, and there were no traces that anyone else had been there. Usually people leave small signs, an empty cup, a wrapper, even just scuff marks on the floor, but it looked untouched, like I'd imagined the whole encounter. What kept gnawing at me was how vivid the conversation had been. He had laughed at my joke about motel mattresses being basically cardboard springs. He had leaned against the wall, tapping the soda can in his hand as he talked. I could still picture the way he gestured, holding the can like it was an extension of his story. These weren't dreamlike fragments, they were solid, grounded details. Yet somehow, according to the motel, Mark never existed in that building. I checked out anyway and drove off, but the entire day on the road, I kept replaying the exchange in my head. The sound of the coins clinking into the slot, the hiss of the soda can dropping, even the way his voice echoed slightly in the tiled hallway. It all felt too real to dismiss. But then I'd remember the clerk's expression, the certainty in her voice, and the map with its neatly numbered rooms. No room 23, no Mark, just me, standing there with a stranger who apparently left no trace at all. That night, after hours on the highway, I stopped at another motel just to get some rest. I sat on the bed with the TV on low, but my attention kept drifting back to Mark. I even considered calling the first motel again to double check, but I already knew what they'd say. There was no record of him, no room with that number. I couldn't shake the sense that I'd spoken with someone who had simply vanished from the paper trail, like he'd never been entered into the system of reality at all. A week later, curiosity finally got the best of me. I phoned the motel and asked, this time pretending I'd lost touch with a friend who had stayed there around the same time I did. The woman at the desk paused, then told me the only guests checked in that night were myself and an older couple traveling from out of state. She was firm about it. Nobody else was here, she said. Her tone wasn't rude. It was almost pitying, like she thought I was confused. That was the moment I realized there would be no neat explanation. I hadn't misheard him. He gave me a name, a room number, details about his travels. I hadn't dreamed him. The condensation on his soda can had dripped onto the floor, and I remembered stepping around the little puddle. And yet, according to every record and every staff member at that motel, Mark never existed. It left me with a strange contradiction, the most vivid memory of a stranger I've ever met, paired with the certainty that no one else could confirm he was real. Even now, whenever I pass through small towns and see glowing motel signs at the edge of the road, I think back to that night. I still hear the clink of coins in the vending machine and his raspy laugh echoing in the hallway. I never saw him again, and maybe that's for the best. But I know, with every fiber of memory, that I shared a conversation with someone who left no trace behind. And that knowledge follows me every time I check into a motel alone.